The experience machine. Our first exploration delves directly into the nature of happiness and what constitutes a truly valuable life. Imagine a technology far beyond anything we currently possess. The experience machine. This hypothetical device, introduced by philosopher Robert Nozick in his 1974 book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, offers a tantalizing proposition. It is a machine that can perfectly simulate any experience you desire, directly stimulating your brain so that you feel as though you are actually living these experiences. Once connected, you would float in a tank, electrodes attached to your brain, completely unaware that your reality is being generated by the machine. You could program a life filled with unending joy, success, adventure, love, creativity, whatever constitutes your ideal existence. You could feel the exhilaration of climbing Mount Everest, the satisfaction of writing a great novel, the warmth of perfect relationships, the thrill of discovery. Crucially, these experiences would feel entirely real from the inside. You would have no memory of choosing to plug in, no sense that your world is anything but authentic. The machine guarantees a lifetime of maximum pleasure and fulfilled desire, tailored precisely to your preferences. Nozick then poses a stark question. Given the choice before you plug in for life, perhaps with short breaks every few years for reprogramming, though even that could be simulated, would you choose to connect to the experience machine? At first blush, the offer seems incredibly tempting. Why endure the struggles, disappointments, pains, and uncertainties of real life when a guaranteed pathway to perpetual happiness is available? If the ultimate goal of life is to maximize positive experiences and minimize negative ones, a view broadly associated with hedonism, then plugging into the machine seems like the most rational choice imaginable. It offers a shortcut to utopia, a life perfected according to your own design. Yet, Nozick suspected, and subsequent discussions have largely confirmed, that most people feel a strong intuitive resistance to plugging in. There's a nagging sense that something essential would be lost, even if the simulated experiences felt indistinguishable from reality. But what, exactly, is missing from the perfect simulation? Nozick uses our hesitation to reveal that we value things other than, or perhaps more than, simply our subjective states of pleasure or happiness. One major concern revolves around authenticity and reality. While the experiences feel real within the machine, they are ultimately artificial, pre-programmed illusions. The achievements are not genuinely earned. The relationships are not with real, independent people. The discoveries are merely fed into your consciousness. Many people value being connected to actual reality, even if that reality is messy, difficult, and sometimes painful. We want to do certain things, not just have the experience of doing them. We want to be a certain type of person, courageous, kind, creative, in the real world, interacting with genuine circumstances and consequences. Plugging into the machine feels like choosing a life of deception, however pleasant. It's the difference between actually climbing the mountain and merely having the simulated sensation of having climbed it. For many, the genuine accomplishment, however flawed, holds more value than the perfect illusion. Another crucial factor is connection to others. In the experience machine, you are fundamentally alone. The people you interact with, love, and cherish are simulations, constructs designed to fulfill your desires. Real relationships are built on mutual interaction, shared vulnerability, unpredictable growth, and the genuine responses of other independent conscious beings. These connections provide much of life's meaning and depth. While the machine could simulate the feeling of love and connection, it cannot provide the real thing. Choosing the machine means severing all ties to actual people and the shared reality they inhabit. Furthermore, the machine bypasses the process of personal growth and character development. Real life involves facing challenges, overcoming obstacles, learning from failure, and adapting to unforeseen circumstances. These struggles, while often unpleasant, shape who we are. They build resilience, empathy, wisdom, and a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world. In the experience machine, where everything conforms to your desires, these challenges are absent. There is no need for courage in the face of simulated danger, no opportunity for genuine compassion if suffering is programmed out, no resilience built if failure is impossible. A life without struggle might seem appealing, but it could also be a life without depth, without the possibility of becoming a better, stronger, or wiser person through genuine adversity. Does happiness divorced from growth and earned virtue constitute a truly fulfilling human life? The thought experiment also implicitly questions the nature of freedom and agency. While inside the machine you feel like you are making choices and living your life, but in reality your entire existence is predetermined by the program you, or someone else, initially selected. You are passively receiving experiences rather than actively shaping your destiny. This lack of genuine agency, the reduction to a mere receptacle for programmed sensations, clashes with the value many place on autonomy and self-determination. Nozick's experience machine serves as a powerful critique of simple hedonistic theories of value, which claim that only pleasure or happiness is intrinsically good. Our reluctance to plug in suggests we value other things intrinsically, being connected to reality, forming genuine relationships, achieving authentic accomplishments, growing as individuals, and exercising real freedom. These values might sometimes involve discomfort or pain, but they contribute to a life we perceive as meaningful and worthwhile in ways that pure, simulated pleasure cannot. The thought experiment encourages us to reflect on what truly matters to us. If offered the machine, would you plug in? If not, what reasons underpin your refusal? What aspects of real life, with all its imperfections, hold more value for you than guaranteed, simulated happiness? Contemplating the experience machine doesn't just tell us about hypothetical technology, it tells us something profound about our deepest values and what we consider essential for a life well lived. The trolley problem. We now shift from the nature of value and happiness to the complex and often uncomfortable domain of ethics and moral decision-making. The trolley problem, first introduced in its modern form by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967 and later extensively analyzed and varied by Judith Jarvis Thomson and others, is perhaps the most famous thought experiment in contemporary ethics. It presents stark choices involving life and death, forcing us to confront conflicting moral intuitions and examine the principles underlying our judgments about right and wrong. The classic scenario is as follows. Imagine you are standing by a set of trolley tracks. In the distance, you see a runaway trolley careening down the track out of control. Further down the track, you see 5 people tied up and unable to move. The trolley is headed straight for them, and if it continues on its path, it will surely kill all 5. However, you happen to be standing next to a lever. If you pull this lever, you can divert the trolley onto a different spur track. The dilemma is this: on the spur track there is one person tied up. You have 2 options. Do nothing. Allow the trolley to continue on its main path, resulting in the deaths of the 5 people. Pull the lever. Divert the trolley onto the spur track, resulting in the death of the 1 person but saving the 5. What is the morally correct thing to do? Most people, when presented with this scenario, lean towards pulling the lever. The reasoning often follows a utilitarian logic, minimizing harm and maximizing good. Saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 seems like the better outcome from a purely quantitative perspective. 5 deaths are worse than 1 death, so the action that leads to fewer deaths appears to be the morally preferable one. This aligns with consequentialism, the ethical framework that judges the morality of an action based on its outcomes or consequences. However, the problem becomes more complex when variations are introduced that challenge this utilitarian intuition. Consider a common variation, often called the footbridge scenario. Imagine the same situation: a runaway trolley heading towards 5 people tied to the track. This time, however, you are not near a lever. Instead, you are standing on a footbridge overlooking the track, positioned between the approaching trolley and the 5 endangered people. Next to you on the footbridge stands a very large person. You realize that the only way to stop the trolley and save the 5 people is to push this large person off the bridge and onto the track below. Their body is heavy enough to stop the trolley, but they will undoubtedly die in the process. Assume you cannot stop the trolley by jumping yourself, perhaps you are too light. You have 2 options. Do nothing. Allow the trolley to kill the 5 people on the track. Push the large person off the bridge. This will kill the large person but save the 5. What is the morally correct thing to do now? Interestingly, most people have a much stronger negative reaction to pushing the person off the footbridge compared to pulling the lever in the original scenario. While the numerical outcome is identical, sacrificing 1 life to save 5, the action involved feels drastically different. Pulling a lever seems indirect. You divert a pre-existing threat. Pushing someone, however, feels like a direct, intentional act of violence against an innocent bystander who was not initially part of the dangerous situation. It involves using them merely as a means to an end, which many find morally abhorrent. This divergence in responses between the lever case and the footbridge case highlights a fundamental tension in ethical thought: the conflict between consequentialist reasoning, focused on outcomes, and deontological reasoning, focused on duties, rights, and the intrinsic nature of actions. Deontological ethics, often associated with philosophers like Immanuel Kant, emphasizes moral rules or principles, such as, do not kill innocent people, or do not use people merely as means. Pushing the person off the bridge seems to violate these principles directly, regardless of the positive consequences of saving 5 others. Pulling the lever while causing a death might be seen by some deontologists as redirecting a threat rather than initiating a direct harmful action against the person on the spur track, though this interpretation is also debated. The trolley problem and its variations are powerful because they isolate different moral factors and force us to weigh them against each other. Action versus omission. Is actively causing a death, pulling the lever, pushing the person, morally worse than allowing deaths to happen by doing nothing? Direct versus indirect harm. Is harming someone directly, pushing, worse than harming them indirectly as a side effect of diverting a threat, pulling the lever? Intention versus foresight. Does the intention behind the action matter? In the lever case, the death of the one person is a foreseen but perhaps unintended consequence of saving the 5. In the footbridge case, the death of the large person seems integral to the plan. You intend for them to be hit by the trolley to stop it. This distinction is related to the doctrine of double effect in moral philosophy. Rights and duties. Does the person on the spur track or the person on the footbridge have a right not to be killed, even if sacrificing them could save more lives? Do we have a stronger duty not to harm than a duty to help? Researchers in moral psychology and neuroscience have used trolley-type dilemmas to study how people make moral judgments. Brain imaging studies suggest that different types of moral dilemmas engage different parts of the brain. Scenarios involving direct personal harm, like the footbridge case, tend to elicit stronger emotional responses, associated with brain regions involved in emotion processing. Scenarios that are more impersonal, like the lever case, tend to engage areas associated with abstract reasoning and cognitive control more heavily. This suggests our moral judgments are often a product of both emotional intuition and rational calculation, and these systems can sometimes conflict. It's crucial to remember that the trolley problem is not designed to have a single correct answer that applies in all situations. Its value lies in its ability to clarify our own moral intuitions and the principles we rely on when faced with difficult choices involving conflicting values. It forces us to articulate why we might choose one action over another, pushing us beyond simple gut reactions towards a more reasoned understanding of our ethical framework. It reveals the complexities of balancing consequences against principles, the welfare of the many against the rights of the few, and the often uncomfortable reality that sometimes all available options involve tragic outcomes. It is a stark exploration of the weight of moral responsibility in a world where choices are rarely simple or clean. Brain in a vat. Our third thought experiment takes us to the very limits of certainty, plunging us into the depths of radical skepticism. The brain in a vat argument is a modern iteration of ancient philosophical worries about the reliability of our senses and the nature of reality itself. It asks, how can you be absolutely certain that your current experience of the world, reading this, feeling the chair beneath you, hearing these words, is real, and not merely a sophisticated illusion generated by an external source? Imagine this scenario, popularized in contemporary philosophy though building on ideas from Descartes' evil demon hypothesis. Unbeknownst to you, your brain has been surgically removed from your body. It is being kept alive in a vat of nutrients in a laboratory. All your nerve endings are connected to a highly advanced supercomputer. This computer simulates a perfectly coherent and interactive virtual reality, feeding your brain patterns of electrical impulses identical to those it would receive if it were still in your body, living a normal life in the real world. Your experience of reading, seeing, feeling, interacting with friends, eating meals, everything you perceive as reality, is nothing more than a complex stream of data generated by the computer. You believe you have a body, but you don't. You believe you are in a particular room, but you are actually in a lab. Your entire perceived existence is an elaborate simulation fed directly into your disembodied brain. The terrifying question posed by this thought experiment is, if you were a brain in a vat, how could you possibly know? From your perspective inside the simulation, everything would seem perfectly normal and real. Your senses report a consistent world, your actions seem to have consequences within that world, you have memories that seem authentic. There would be no internal clue, no glitch in the matrix, unless the simulators made a mistake, to reveal the true nature of your situation. Any evidence you might try to gather to prove you aren't a brain in a vat, touching the wall, pinching yourself, talking to others, would itself be part of the simulation generated by the supercomputer. The computer could simulate the feeling of pinching yourself, simulate the wall's texture, simulate the responses of other people. Any scientific experiment you conduct would yield results consistent with the simulated reality's laws. There seems to be no possible experience or test you could perform from within your perceived reality that could definitively prove you are not a brain in a vat. This thought experiment is a powerful tool for exploring philosophical skepticism, particularly external world skepticism, the doubt about whether the external world, everything outside our own minds, actually exists or is as we perceive it. It challenges the foundations of our knowledge. We typically assume our senses provide reliable information about an external reality. The brain in a vat scenario suggests this assumption might be fundamentally unprovable. If our experiences could be perfectly replicated by a simulation, then those experiences cannot serve as conclusive evidence for the existence of the external world they seem to represent. The argument often takes this logical form. If I know that some ordinary proposition p.e.g., I have hands, is true, then I must know that I am not a brain in a vat, BIV. Because if I were a BIV, P would be false. I do not know that I am not a brain in a vat, because there's no way to definitively prove it from my experience. Therefore, I do not know that the ordinary proposition p.e.g., I have hands, is true. This conclusion is deeply unsettling, suggesting that we might not truly know even the most basic facts about our world and ourselves. Philosophers have responded to the brain in a vat argument in various ways. Accepting skepticism. Some concede that the argument is sound and that we cannot have absolute certainty about the external world. However, they might argue that we can still have justified beliefs or practical certainty sufficient for navigating life. Semantic externalism. Putnam's response. Philosopher Hilary Putnam offered a famous argument attempting to show that the statement, "I am a brain in a vat," must be false if uttered or thought by an actual brain in a vat. His argument relies on semantic externalism, similar ideas explored in the twin earth thought experiment. Putnam argued that the words brain and vat get their meaning from causal interactions with actual brains and vats in the external world. A brain that has only ever experienced the simulated reality fed by the computer could not successfully refer to real brains or real vats. Its vat English words would refer only to simulated images or concepts within the program. Therefore, if someone truthfully asserts, "I am a brain in a vat," they must have had causal contact with real brains and vats, meaning they cannot currently be a brain in that vat whose entire experience is simulated. This argument is clever but controversial, relying on specific theories about meaning and reference. Contextualism. This epistemological view suggests that the standards for knowledge change depending on the context. In everyday contexts, when the brain in a vat possibility isn't being seriously considered, it's perfectly reasonable to say, "I know I have hands." However, in a philosophical context where skeptical scenarios are being raised, the standards for knowledge become much higher, and perhaps then we cannot truthfully claim to know we have hands, because we haven't ruled out the BIV possibility. Knowledge claims are thus context-sensitive. Inference to the best explanation/abductive reasoning. While we cannot deductively prove we aren't BIVs, perhaps the real-world hypothesis is simply a much better explanation for the coherence, complexity, and regularity of our experiences than the convoluted BIV hypothesis, which requires positing advanced technology, malevolent scientists or AI, etc. We might rationally prefer the simpler, more parsimonious explanation that our senses, while fallible, generally connect us to an actual external reality. This isn't proof, but an argument for rational preference based on explanatory power. More's defense of common sense. Philosopher G. Moore famously argued against skepticism by holding up his hand and declaring, "Here is one hand." He essentially argued that the certainty we have in basic common sense beliefs, like having hands, is far greater than the certainty we might have in the premises of a complex skeptical argument. We should trust our foundational beliefs over philosophical paradoxes. While appealing to common sense, critics argue this doesn't directly refute the logical structure of the skeptical argument. The brain in a vat thought experiment, regardless of proposed solutions, remains profoundly impactful. It forces us to confront the limits of empirical evidence and the fundamental assumptions underlying our claims to knowledge. It makes us question the relationship between mind, experience, and reality. While it might seem like a far-fetched scenario, its core challenge resonates with modern concerns about virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and the potential for simulated worlds. Could we become the brains in the vats of our own technological creation? The experiment serves as a stark, enduring reminder of the fragility of certainty and the enduring philosophical quest to understand our place in reality. Excellent. Let's continue our journey into these thought-provoking experiments. The Chinese room argument. Our next thought experiment takes us into the heart of debates about artificial intelligence, consciousness, and the nature of understanding. Proposed by philosopher John Searle in 1980, the Chinese room argument challenges the claim that a computer, merely by manipulating symbols according to rules, can never truly understand language or possess genuine consciousness in the way humans do. It specifically targets the view known as strong AI, which posits that a sufficiently complex computer program running on the right hardware is not just a simulation of a mind, but is a mind capable of understanding and conscious thought. Searle asks us to imagine the following scenario. Suppose researchers have developed an advanced AI program that can process Chinese language perfectly. If you feed it questions written in Chinese, it produces fluent, appropriate, and indistinguishable from human answers in Chinese. Proponents of strong AI might claim that this program genuinely understands Chinese. Now, Searle asks you to imagine yourself inside a closed room. You do not understand a single word of Chinese. Inside the room with you are several baskets filled with Chinese symbols, ideograms, and a large, detailed rule book written in English, your native language. This rule book provides instructions for manipulating the Chinese symbols based purely on their shapes or syntax. For instance, the rule book might say, if you see symbol sequence X come through the input slot, then find symbol sequence Y in basket A and pass it out through the output slot. People outside the room who are fluent Chinese speakers slide slips of paper with questions written in Chinese under the door, the input. Your job is to follow the instructions in the English rule book meticulously. You look at the incoming Chinese symbols, find the corresponding rule in the book, locate the required output symbols in the baskets based on their shapes, assemble them according to the rule, and slide the resulting slip of paper back out through the output slot. From the perspective of the Chinese speakers outside the room, your responses are perfect. They ask complex questions in Chinese, and they receive coherent, meaningful answers in Chinese. They might reasonably conclude that whoever or whatever is inside the room understands Chinese thoroughly. But here is Searle's crucial point. You inside the room do not understand Chinese. You have simply become extremely adept at manipulating uninterpreted symbols according to a formal set of rules. You are following syntactic rules, manipulating symbols based on shape and position, but have absolutely no grasp of the semantics, the meaning, of the symbols you are processing. You don't know what the questions mean, nor what your answers mean. You are behaving as if you understand Chinese, but without any actual comprehension. Searle argues that the situation of the person inside the Chinese room is analogous to what a digital computer does when running a program. A computer processes information by manipulating symbols, sequences of zeros and ones, according to formal rules, the program's algorithm. Even if a computer can pass the Turing Test, meaning its linguistic output is indistinguishable from a human's, Searle argues, it doesn't necessarily mean the computer understands the language it's processing, any more than the person in the room understands Chinese. It's merely syntactic manipulation, devoid of genuine semantic content or conscious awareness. Therefore, Searle concludes strong AI is false. Running a program, no matter how complex, cannot by itself be sufficient for creating genuine understanding or consciousness. Minds, he suggests, have intrinsic mental content or intentionality, a directedness towards objects and meanings, that purely formal symbol manipulation lacks. Computers simulate intelligence, they don't instantiate it. The Chinese room argument has generated enormous debate and numerous counterarguments. The system's reply, this is perhaps the most common objection. It concedes that the person inside the room doesn't understand Chinese, but argues that the entire system, consisting of the person, the room, the baskets of symbols, and the rule book, does understand Chinese. Understanding is an emergent property of the whole system operating together, not located solely in the human symbol manipulator. Searle's response to this is often called the internalization argument. Imagine the person memorizes the entire rule book and internalizes the whole process, doing the symbol manipulation in their head while standing in an open field. Now the entire system is just the person, yet Searle insists they still wouldn't understand Chinese. They'd just be incredibly fast at symbol manipulation. The robot reply. This objection argues that genuine understanding requires interaction with the world. If we put the Chinese room system inside a robot body with sensors, cameras, microphones, and actuators, arms, legs, allowing it to perceive and interact with its environment, then the symbols it manipulates would become grounded in real-world experience, potentially leading to genuine understanding. Searle counters that adding perceptual inputs and motor outputs doesn't fundamentally change the situation. The central processing unit, the person or computer inside, is still just manipulating uninterpreted symbols based on formal rules, even if those symbols now correlate with sensory data. The grounding isn't sufficient for semantics. The brain simulator reply: what if the program doesn't just simulate conversation, but simulates the actual neural firing patterns of a native Chinese speaker's brain? If the computer simulates the brain synapse by synapse, wouldn't that necessarily create understanding? Searle remains skeptical, arguing that even a perfect simulation of brain activity is still just a simulation. It lacks the actual causal powers of biological brains that he believes are necessary for consciousness and intentionality, though what these specific causal powers are remains debated. The other minds reply: how do we know any other person truly understands Chinese or is conscious? We only observe their behavior, including linguistic output. If the Chinese room system behaves indistinguishably from a native speaker, isn't it just as reasonable to attribute understanding to the system as it is to another human? Searle argues this misses the point. We have direct access to our own understanding and know it's more than just behavior, whereas the thought experiment shows how behavior can be produced without understanding. The intuition pump objection. Some critics, like Daniel Dennett, argue that the Chinese room is merely an intuition pump, a thought experiment designed to elicit a strong intuitive reaction that the person doesn't understand, but that doesn't actually prove its conclusion rigorously. They argue our intuitions about complex systems and emergent understanding might be unreliable. The Chinese room argument remains a central point of contention in the philosophy of mind and artificial intelligence. It forces us to grapple with fundamental questions. What does it mean to understand? Is intelligence purely computational symbol manipulation, or does it require something more, perhaps consciousness, subjective experience, or specific biological properties? Can semantics arise purely from syntax? As AI continues to advance, producing systems that are increasingly sophisticated in their linguistic abilities, Searle's thought experiment serves as a crucial, persistent challenge, reminding us to question whether creating something that acts intelligent is the same as creating something that truly is intelligent and understands its world. Mary's room. Our next thought experiment invites us into a starkly different room, one designed to explore the nature of conscious experience itself, specifically the subjective quality of sensations, often referred to by philosophers as qualia. Proposed by philosopher Frank Jackson in 1982, the Mary's room argument, also known as the knowledge argument, challenges physicalism. The philosophical view that everything in the universe, including mental states like consciousness, is ultimately physical or reducible to physical properties and processes. Jackson asks us to imagine Mary, a brilliant neuroscientist who lives her entire life from birth, confined to a black and white room. Through black and white books and monitors displaying black and white images, she learns everything there is to know about the physical science of color vision. She becomes the world's leading expert. She understands the physics of light wavelengths, the physiology of the eye's cones and rods, the complex neural pathways that process visual information in the brain, how different wavelengths typically cause specific verbal reports, like saying red when shown light of a certain frequency, and all the functional roles associated with color perception. She possesses complete physical knowledge relevant to color vision. She knows all the objective, third-person scientific facts. Now, imagine that one day Mary is released from her black and white room and for the very first time, sees a ripe red tomato. She experiences the color red directly. The crucial question Jackson poses is, does Mary learn anything new when she sees red for the first time? The strong intuition shared by most people considering the scenario is that yes, Mary does learn something new. She learns what it is like to see red. She acquires knowledge of the subjective, qualitative character of the color experience. The redness of red, something that all her prior purely physical knowledge seemingly could not convey. This subjective quality of experience, the raw feel of a sensation, is what philosophers call a quale, plural, qualia. If this intuition is correct, and Mary learns something new upon experiencing red, then it seems her previous, complete physical knowledge about color vision was, in fact, incomplete. There was some knowledge about the subjective quality of color experience, that was missing from the purely physical account. Therefore, Jackson argues physicalism must be false. If there are truths about conscious experience, like what it's like to see red, that cannot be captured or deduced solely from the complete physical truths about the brain and its processes, then mental states cannot be entirely reduced to physical states. There must be more to consciousness than just physical facts. There must be non-physical properties or facts related to qualia. The Mary's room argument has been highly influential and, like the Chinese room, has generated extensive debate and numerous objections. The ability hypothesis, proposed by David Lewis and Lawrence Nemiro, this view argues that what Mary gains upon seeing red is not new factual knowledge, propositional knowledge, knowing that, but rather new abilities, knowing how. She gains the ability to recognize red things by sight, the ability to imagine red, and the ability to remember the experience of red. These are practical skills or cognitive abilities, not new pieces of information about the nature of reality. Since physicalism is typically a claim about the completeness of factual knowledge, gaining new abilities doesn't necessarily contradict it. Jackson himself later came to favor this view and retracted his original anti-physicalist conclusion. The acquaintance hypothesis, similar to the ability hypothesis, this view associated with Earl Coney, suggests Mary doesn't learn a new fact but becomes acquainted with a property, the quality of redness, she previously only knew by description. It's a new mode of presentation of something she might have already known about under a different, physical description. Knowledge by acquaintance is different from knowledge by description, and gaining the former doesn't imply the incompleteness of the latter in terms of capturing all physical facts. Old fact, new representation/phenomenal concepts. Some argue Mary doesn't learn a new fact, but learns an old physical fact under a new representation or acquires a new phenomenal concept. Before release, she knew about the neural state corresponding to seeing red under its neuroscientific description. After release, she comes to know that same neural state via introspection, using a new phenomenal concept acquired through direct experience. The underlying reality being referred to is still purely physical, but she gains a new way to think about it. Intuition failure. Critics might argue that the thought experiment relies too heavily on our intuition, which might be misleading when dealing with concepts as complex as complete physical knowledge and subjective experience. Can we truly conceive of what it means to have complete physical knowledge? Perhaps if Mary truly had all the physical facts, she would be able to deduce or predict what seeing red would be like, even if our limited imagination struggles to grasp how. Physicalism is broader. Some physicalists argue that physicalism doesn't necessarily require that qualia be deducible from current physics, only that they are ultimately grounded in physical properties, perhaps ones we don't fully understand yet. Or perhaps qualia are physical properties, just very complex ones related to functional states or representational content within the brain, and Mary simply gains a new way to access or token that physical state. Despite these objections, the Mary's room argument continues to resonate because it powerfully captures the apparent gap between objective, third-person scientific descriptions of the brain and the subjective, first-person reality of conscious experience. How can the intricate dance of neurons, synapses, and neurotransmitters give rise to the feeling of warmth, the taste of chocolate, the sound of a C-sharp, or the vibrant redness of a tomato? The thought experiment crystallizes the challenge that qualia pose to a purely physicalist worldview. It forces us to confront the mystery of subjective experience and question whether a complete scientific understanding of the brain can ever fully capture what it is like to be a conscious subject experiencing the world. The veil of ignorance. Our focus now shifts again, moving from the nature of mind and knowledge to the foundations of political philosophy and social justice. We explore the veil of ignorance, a thought experiment proposed by the highly influential political philosopher John Rawls in his seminal 1971 work, A Theory of Justice. Rawls uses this conceptual device not to describe reality, but as a method for reasoning impartially about the fundamental principles that should govern a just and fair society. Rawls asks us to imagine a hypothetical situation he calls the original position. In this situation, a group of rational individuals must come together to agree upon the basic structure and principles of justice for the society they are about to enter and live in. They need to decide on principles governing rights, liberties, opportunities, and the distribution of resources and social goods. Now comes the crucial element. These individuals deliberate behind a veil of ignorance. This metaphorical veil prevents them from knowing specific facts about themselves and their own future position within the society they are designing. Specifically, they do not know their race, ethnicity, gender, or social class, their natural talents, abilities, intelligence, or physical strength, their psychological predispositions, e.g., whether they are risk-averse or risk-taking, optimistic or pessimistic, their personal conception of the good life, their specific values, goals, religious beliefs, or philosophical views, the particular economic or political circumstances of their society, e.g., its level of wealth, its culture, its generation in history. However, they do possess general knowledge about human psychology, economics, social organization, and the laws of nature. They understand that resources are moderately scarce and that people have different goals and values, leading to potential conflicts. They are assumed to be rational, meaning they will try to choose principles that best advance their own interests, and they are mutually disinterested, meaning they aren't primarily motivated by envy or altruism towards others in the original position, though they might choose principles that result in altruistic behavior within society. The purpose of the veil of ignorance is to ensure impartiality. By stripping away knowledge of their own specific advantages or disadvantages, the veil forces the individuals in the original position to choose principles from a standpoint of fairness, considering what would be acceptable no matter who they turn out to be when the veil is lifted. They cannot tailor principles to favor their own particular group, talents, or beliefs, because they don't know what those will be. They must choose principles that would be rational and fair even if they ended up being among the least advantaged members of society. Rawls argues that rational individuals behind the veil of ignorance, seeking to secure the best possible outcome for themselves regardless of their eventual position, would agree upon two fundamental principles of justice, ordered lexicographically, meaning the first principle must be fully satisfied before the second comes into play. The liberty principle. Each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. This includes fundamental rights like freedom of thought, conscience, speech, assembly, the right to vote, hold property, and freedom from arbitrary arrest, the basic political and civil liberties typically associated with liberal democracies. Rawls argues people behind the veil would prioritize these liberties above all else, as they are essential for pursuing any conception of the good life, whatever it may turn out to be. They wouldn't risk sacrificing basic freedoms for potential economic gain, as they might end up being part of a minority whose freedoms are curtailed. The second principle, dealing with social and economic inequalities. Social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both a. The difference principle, to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. This means inequalities, e.g., in income or wealth, are only justified if they work to make the worst-off group in society better off than they would be under any alternative arrangement, perhaps by providing incentives that increase overall productivity and thus the resources available for redistribution. People behind the veil, Rawls argues, would adopt a maximin strategy, maximizing the minimum position, because they don't know where they'll end up and want to ensure the best possible outcome even if they land at the bottom. B. The fair equality of opportunity principle, attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. This means that everyone should have a fair chance to attain desirable positions and offices, regardless of their social background. It requires more than just formal non-discrimination. It implies proactive measures, like access to education and healthcare, to ensure that people with similar talents and motivation have similar life chances. The veil of ignorance thought experiment is powerful because it provides a framework for reasoning about justice that attempts to transcend personal biases and self-interest. By forcing us to consider society from an impartial perspective, imagining we could be anyone, it pushes us towards principles that protect the vulnerable and promote fairness. It aims to model the conditions under which a hypothetical social contract, based on fairness rather than bargaining power, could be reached. Of course, the thought experiment is not without its critics. Critiques of the original position. Some argue the assumptions made about the individual's rationality, mutual disinterest, or the information allowed behind the veil are unrealistic or biased towards a particular liberal worldview. Critiques of the maximin strategy. Why assume people would be so risk-averse as to only focus on maximizing the position of the worst off? Perhaps some behind the veil would be willing to gamble on principles that allow for greater overall wealth or higher top positions, even at the risk of a lower bottom position. Libertarian objections. Philosophers like Robert Nozick, who proposed the experience machine, argued that Rawls's principles, particularly the difference principle, unjustly interfere with individual liberty and property rights. They argue justice is about rightful acquisition and transfer of property, not about achieving specific distributive patterns. Communitarian objections. Some argue that the concept of individuals choosing principles in isolation from their community, culture, and traditions as behind the veil is incoherent, as our identities and values are deeply shaped by these contexts. Despite these criticisms, the veil of ignorance remains a landmark thought experiment in political philosophy. It provides a compelling procedural method for thinking about justice, fairness, and the kind of society we would choose if we didn't know our own place within it. It encourages empathy by asking us to step into the shoes of the least advantaged and consider principles that protect everyone's fundamental rights and provide genuine opportunities for all. It challenges us to justify social and economic inequalities based on whether they benefit everyone, especially those at the bottom, rather than simply accepting them as natural or inevitable. It is a call to reason from a position of impartiality, aiming for a society grounded in fairness. Plato's Cave. We now journey back thousands of years to ancient Greece, to explore one of the most enduring and influential allegories in the history of Western philosophy, Plato's allegory of the cave. Presented in his monumental work, The Republic, this allegory is not strictly a paradox or a single thought experiment with a defined question, but rather a powerful narrative metaphor designed to illustrate Plato's theory of forms, the nature of reality, the limits of human perception, the process of education, and the philosopher's role in society. It challenges us to question the reality we perceive through our senses and consider the possibility of a deeper, more fundamental level of existence. Plato asks us to imagine a group of prisoners who have lived their entire lives chained inside a dark cave. They are positioned facing a blank wall, unable to turn their heads. Behind them, unseen, burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners, there is a raised walkway along which people walk, carrying various objects, puppets, or statues. The fire casts shadows of these objects onto the wall that the prisoners face. Since the prisoners have never known anything else, these flickering shadows constitute their entire reality. They watch the shadows move, they listen to the echoes of voices bounced off the cave wall, mistaking them for the sounds of the shadows themselves. They give names to the shadows, and they might even hold contests predicting which shadow will appear next. For them, the shadows are the true objects. They have no conception of the actual objects casting the shadows, nor of the fire creating the light. Now, Plato imagines what would happen if one of these prisoners were suddenly freed. First, they would be forced to turn around and look towards the fire. The bright light would hurt their eyes, which are accustomed only to darkness. They would be confused and likely disoriented. If someone showed them the actual objects being carried along the walkway, whose shadows they had mistaken for reality, they would likely find the objects less real and less clear than the shadows they were used to. They might even try to turn back to the familiar comfort of the shadow world. Suppose, however, the freed prisoner is then dragged forcibly out of the cave, up a steep and rugged ascent, and into the sunlight of the outside world. The brilliance of the sun would be overwhelming at first, causing immense pain and temporary blindness. Gradually, their eyes would adjust. They would first be able to look at shadows, real shadows this time, then reflections in water, then perhaps the objects themselves. Eventually, they would be able to look at the moon and the stars at night. Finally, after much adaptation, they would be able to look directly at the sun itself. Upon experiencing the outside world, the freed prisoner would realize that the shadows in the cave were merely pale imitations of true reality. They would understand that the objects outside are more real than the puppets inside, and that the sun is the ultimate source of light and life, responsible for sight and the very existence of the things they now perceive. They would feel pity for their fellow prisoners still trapped in the darkness and ignorance of the cave, mistaking shadows for truth. Plato then considers what would happen if this enlightened individual were to return to the cave, seeking to free the others. Their eyes, now accustomed to sunlight, would struggle to readjust to the darkness. They would appear clumsy and inept in the dim light, unable to perceive the shadows as clearly as the remaining prisoners who had never left. If they tried to explain the reality of the outside world, the prisoners would likely mock them, think they were crazy, or believe the journey outside had ruined their eyesight and corrupted their mind. If the freed prisoner persisted in trying to release the others and lead them upward, the prisoners, fearing the unknown and clinging to their familiar shadow reality, might even turn violently upon them and try to kill them. This rich allegory operates on multiple levels. Epistemological level, theory of knowledge. The cave represents the world of sensory experience, the physical world we perceive around us. The shadows on the wall represent the imperfect, transient objects and opinions we encounter through our senses. The prisoners represent ordinary humans, trapped by their limited perception and mistaking appearances for reality. The journey out of the cave represents the process of philosophical education and enlightenment, moving from mere opinion, doxa, towards true knowledge, episteme. The outside world represents the realm of the forms, the perfect, eternal, unchanging essences or archetypes of things, like beauty itself, justice itself, goodness itself, which Plato believed were the true reality, accessible only through reason and intellectual contemplation. The sun represents the ultimate form, the form of the good, which illuminates all other forms and is the highest object of knowledge. Metaphysical level, theory of reality. The allegory distinguishes between two levels of reality: the visible world of appearances, the cave, and the intelligible world of the forms, the outside world. True reality for Plato lies in the eternal forms, not in the changing, imperfect physical objects that are mere copies or shadows of these forms. Political and ethical level. The freed prisoner who returns represents the philosopher. Having grasped true reality, the forms, especially the form of the good, the philosopher has a duty, according to Plato, to return to the cave, the political realm, and try to enlighten others and govern justly, even though they will likely be misunderstood and resisted. This reflects Plato's idea of the philosopher king, arguing that only those who have attained true knowledge are fit to rule. Plato's cave remains profoundly relevant today. It challenges us to critically examine the sources of our beliefs and perceptions. Are we accepting shadows as reality? Are we influenced by illusions, propaganda, or the limited perspectives of our immediate environment, our cave? It encourages intellectual humility, recognizing that what seems real might only be a partial or distorted view. It speaks to the often difficult process of learning and changing one's worldview, the potential pain involved in confronting uncomfortable truths, like the initial blinding light, and the resistance one might face when trying to share deeper insights with those content with familiar illusions. The allegory doesn't provide easy answers but serves as a timeless invitation to philosophical reflection. It asks us to consider what is truly real, how we can attain genuine knowledge beyond mere appearances, and what responsibilities come with that knowledge. Are we living in a cave of our own making? And if so, do we have the courage to seek the light outside? The Ship of Theseus. We revisit the familiar Ship of Theseus paradox, but this time we apply its central question. What constitutes identity through change? Specifically to the most intimate and arguably most perplexing subject, human consciousness and the sense of self. While the original paradox focused on a physical object, applying it to the mind raises even deeper and more personal questions about what makes you the same person across your lifespan, despite constant physical and psychological flux. As we've noted, the physical components of our bodies, including our brains, are constantly being replaced. Cellular turnover ensures that the material, stuff, that constitutes you now is different from the stuff that constituted you years ago. If strict material identity were the criterion, none of us would persist as the same person for more than a few years. Clearly, our intuition about personal identity relies on something more than just the persistence of the same atoms. The Ship of Theseus, when applied to consciousness, forces us to scrutinize the alternative criteria, primarily psychological continuity. We feel like the same person because we remember our past experiences, possess a relatively stable set of personality traits, beliefs, and values, and experience a continuous stream of consciousness linking our moments together. This psychological ship seems to sail through time, even as the physical planks, atoms and cells, are replaced. But just as the physical ship could have its planks replaced, what happens if parts of our psychological ship are replaced or drastically altered? Consider memory. Memory is often seen as central to personal identity. John Locke famously argued that personal identity extends only as far back as consciousness can be extended by memory. If you remember doing something yesterday, that past self is part of your identity. But what about memories that are lost? If someone suffers severe amnesia and forgets large portions of their past, are they still the same person? Do they lose part of their identity? Or consider false memories. If someone vividly remembers something that never happened, does that false memory become part of their identity narrative? If memories, the planks of our psychological continuity, can be lost or distorted, how reliable are they as a foundation for enduring identity? Now consider personality, beliefs, and values. these also change over time. The person you were as a teenager likely had different beliefs, values, and personality traits than the person you are today. People undergo gradual shifts and sometimes radical transformations through life experiences, education, trauma, or deliberate self-improvement. If your core personality and beliefs change significantly, are you still fundamentally the same person? Where is the line between normal character development and a change so drastic that it constitutes a loss of the original self? If the psychological planks are substantially different, is the ship of consciousness still the same vessel? The thought experiment becomes even more pointed when we consider hypothetical scenarios involving technology, similar to the teletransportation paradox. Gradual brain replacement. Imagine, as discussed before, replacing biological neurons one by one with perfectly functioning artificial equivalents. If psychological continuity, memory, personality, consciousness, is perfectly preserved throughout this gradual process, does the person remain the same even when their entire brain substrate changes from biological to artificial? Does the type of plank matter, or only the overall structure and function they maintain? Mind uploading/copying. If consciousness could be perfectly scanned and uploaded to a computer, or copied into another biological or artificial brain, would the resulting entity be the same conscious self? This scenario directly pits psychological continuity against the notion of a unique, singular stream of awareness. If a perfect psychological copy exists, it seems to have the same claim to the identity based on psychological criteria, yet our intuition often insists on a single, unique self. Is the original consciousness transferred, copied, or destroyed? Applying the Ship of Theseus logic here leads to difficult questions. If the original brain, the original ship, is destroyed after uploading/copying, plank replacement, is the new entity, the restored ship, still you? If the original brain continues to exist alongside the copy, like the reconstructed ship made of old planks, which one holds the true identity? These applications highlight that our concept of personal identity, particularly consciousness, might be even more complex than the identity of physical objects. We seem to value both a form of continuity, psychological, and a sense of unique, first-person subjectivity that resists easy duplication or transfer. Some philosophical responses suggest we might need to abandon the idea of a simple, enduring self altogether. Perhaps personal identity is more like a useful fiction, a narrative we construct to make sense of our continuous stream of experiences, rather than a deep metaphysical fact. Derek Parfit's view, emphasizing psychological connectedness, relation R, over strict identity, becomes particularly relevant here. Maybe what matters isn't whether the consciousness is strictly the same, but whether the psychological patterns, memories, and character traits continue, regardless of the substrate or minor interruptions. Alternatively, some theories of consciousness posit something non-physical or emergent that constitutes the self, something beyond mere physical parts or psychological patterns. Such views might suggest that consciousness cannot be simply copied or transferred like information, and that the original stream of awareness is unique and irreplaceable. However, defining and defending such non-physical or uniquely emergent properties faces its own significant philosophical challenges. Applying the Ship of Theseus to consciousness, therefore, doesn't provide an easy answer but deepens the mystery. It reveals the fragility of our sense of self when subjected to logical scrutiny and hypothetical change. It forces us to confront what we truly believe constitutes our core being, our physical body, our memories, our personality, our stream of awareness, or perhaps something else entirely. Like the ship sailing on ever-changing waters, our consciousness persists through constant change, leaving us to ponder the enduring question of what remains the same amidst the flow. Laplace's demon. We now explore a thought experiment born not from philosophy directly, but from the ambitions of classical physics, yet one that has profound implications for metaphysics, particularly the age-old debate between determinism and free will. This is the concept of Laplace's demon, articulated by the French scholar Pierre-Simon Laplace in 1814. It envisions a hypothetical intellect vast enough to comprehend the entire state of the universe at a single moment, raising questions about predictability, causality, and human agency. Laplace lived during a time when Newtonian mechanics reigned supreme. The universe, according to Newton's laws of motion and universal gravitation, appeared to operate like a giant, intricate clockwork mechanism. If you knew the position, mass, and velocity of every particle in the system, You could, in principle, use Newton's laws to calculate their exact positions and velocities at any point in the future or the past. The universe seemed deterministic. Every event was necessitated by prior causes and conditions according to fixed physical laws. Laplace took this deterministic worldview to its ultimate logical conclusion. He wrote, "We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion, and all positions of all items of which nature is composed. If this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect nothing would be uncertain and the future just like the past would be present before its eyes." This hypothetical superintellect is what became known as Laplace's demon. It's not a supernatural entity, but rather a theoretical possibility representing perfect knowledge and computational ability within a deterministic, clockwork universe. The demon knows the precise state of every particle, its position and momentum, at one instant. It also knows all the physical laws governing their interactions. With this complete information and unlimited computational power, the demon can calculate the entire trajectory of every particle forward and backward in time. The entire history and future of the universe would be laid bare before it, a predictable unfolding of cause and effect. The implications of this thought experiment for free will are stark and deeply unsettling. If the universe is truly deterministic in the way Laplace envisioned, then every event, including every human thought, decision, and action, is simply the predetermined outcome of prior physical states and laws. Your feeling of choosing what to eat for breakfast this morning, your decision to listen to this audio, your deliberations about future plans, all of it would be, in principle, predictable by Laplace's demon from the state of the universe long before you were born. Your subjective experience of freedom, of making choices among genuine alternatives, would be an illusion. You are simply acting out a script written by the initial conditions of the universe and the immutable laws of physics. This deterministic view challenges deeply held beliefs about human autonomy, moral responsibility, creativity, and the very meaning of our lives. If our actions are predetermined, can we truly be held responsible for them? Does praise or blame make sense? Is creativity just the complex unfolding of prior causes? Can life have meaning if we are just cogs in a cosmic machine? Laplace's demon represents the peak of classical deterministic thinking. However, the situation became significantly more complicated with the advent of 20th century physics, particularly quantum mechanics and chaos theory. Quantum mechanics. At the subatomic level, quantum mechanics introduced inherent randomness and indeterminacy into physics. Principles like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle state that it's impossible to simultaneously know both the exact position and exact momentum of a particle beyond a certain limit of precision. Furthermore, processes like radioactive decay seem to be fundamentally probabilistic. We can predict the probability of decay over time but not the exact moment a specific atom will decay. If the universe has elements of genuine randomness at its most fundamental level, then even Laplace's demon, possessing all possible measurable information, could not predict the future with absolute certainty. The clockwork universe gives way to a probabilistic one, potentially opening a door for genuine unpredictability, though whether this quantum randomness translates into meaningful free will at the macroscopic level of human brains is still a subject of intense debate. Some argue quantum effects are too small to influence large-scale brain processes, while others explore quantum consciousness theories. Chaos theory. Even within classical, deterministic systems, chaos theory reveals that many systems exhibit extreme sensitivity to initial conditions. This is often called the butterfly effect. A tiny change in the starting state, like the flap of a butterfly's wings, can lead to dramatically different outcomes later on. For Laplace's demon to perfectly predict the future, it would need infinitely precise knowledge of the initial conditions of every particle. Any microscopic error, any rounding off however small, could be amplified over time, rendering long-term predictions completely inaccurate for chaotic systems, like weather patterns or potentially even brain activity. While the system might still be deterministic in principle, it becomes unpredictable in practice for any predictor with even the slightest limitation in measurement accuracy. This doesn't restore free will in the philosophical sense, but it severely undermines the idea of practical, absolute predictability even within a deterministic framework. Despite these modern challenges, Laplace's demon remains a powerful conceptual tool. It forces us to confront the implications of determinism in its purest form. It serves as a benchmark against which we measure our understanding of causality, predictability, and agency. Even if perfect prediction is impossible due to quantum mechanics or chaos theory, the underlying question persists. To what extent are our actions the necessary outcomes of prior causes, whether those causes are purely deterministic or include probabilistic elements? The thought experiment pushes us to clarify what we mean by free will. Does it require genuine indeterminism, the ability to have chosen otherwise in the exact same circumstances, libertarian free will? Or is it compatible with determinism, perhaps defined as acting according to one's conscious desires and reasons, without external coercion, even if those desires and reasons are themselves ultimately determined by prior causes, compatibilism? Or is free will simply an illusion, regardless of whether the universe is deterministic or indeterministic, hard determinism or hard incompatibilism? Laplace's demon, therefore, isn't just about physics. It's a gateway to fundamental questions about our nature as agents in the universe. It asks us to consider the chain of causality stretching back to the beginning of time and to ponder whether our feeling of being the authors of our own lives is a profound truth or a comforting illusion generated by the intricate, perhaps predictable, perhaps chaotic, workings of the cosmos. Maxwell's demon. We now delve into a thought experiment that sits at the intersection of physics, information theory, and the fundamental laws governing energy and entropy. Proposed by the Scottish physicist James Clerk Maxwell in 1867, Maxwell's demon presents a hypothetical scenario that seems, at first glance, to violate the second law of thermodynamics, one of the most fundamental principles in physics, which states that the total entropy, a measure of disorder or randomness, of an isolated system can only increase over time, never decrease. Maxwell asks us to imagine a container divided into two chambers, A and B, by an insulating wall. Both chambers are filled with the same gas at the same uniform temperature. In the dividing wall, there is a tiny, massless door or shutter. Now, imagine a hypothetical, intelligent being, the demon, who can observe individual gas molecules as they approach the door. This demon operates the door with negligible effort. The demon's task is simple. It watches the molecules approaching the door from both sides. When it sees a faster-than-average molecule approaching from chamber A heading towards chamber B, it quickly opens the door to let it pass through, then closes it. When it sees a slower-than-average molecule approaching from chamber B heading towards chamber A, it opens the door to let it pass through, then closes it. It does not allow fast molecules from B to go to A, nor slow molecules from A to go to B. What is the result of the demon's actions over time? By selectively allowing only fast molecules into chamber B and only slow molecules into chamber A, the demon effectively sorts the molecules by speed. Since the temperature of a gas is directly related to the average kinetic energy, and thus speed, of its molecules, chamber B will gradually become hotter, filled with faster molecules, and chamber A will become cooler, filled with slower molecules. This outcome appears to contradict the second law of thermodynamics. We started with a system in thermal equilibrium, uniform temperature, which represents a state of relatively high entropy or disorder. The demon, through its seemingly simple actions of observation and sorting, has created a temperature difference between the two chambers without doing any significant work itself. Operating the massless door is assumed to take negligible energy. This temperature difference represents a state of lower entropy, a more ordered system. Furthermore, this temperature difference could potentially be used to do work, e.g., run a heat engine between the hot and cold chambers, effectively creating useful energy from a system that was initially at uniform temperature. The second law states that entropy in an isolated system should never decrease spontaneously. Yet, Maxwell's demon seems to achieve just that. For decades, this thought experiment puzzled physicists. Does the demon represent a genuine loophole in the second law, or is there some hidden cost or overlooked factor in its operation? The resolution began to emerge with the development of statistical mechanics and, crucially, information theory in the 20th century. Several key insights helped exorcise the demon. The demon needs information. To perform its sorting task, the demon must first acquire information about the speed and position of the approaching molecules. It needs to measure them or observe them in some way. This act of measurement itself has thermodynamic consequences. Early arguments by Leo Szilard in 1929 suggested that the act of gaining information necessarily involves an increase in entropy somewhere in the system, or requires energy expenditure, potentially offsetting the decrease in entropy achieved by sorting. Information is physical. Landauer's principle. A more definitive resolution came from Rolf Landauer in 1961 with his formulation of Landauer's principle. This principle states that any logically irreversible manipulation of information, such as erasing a bit of information, must be accompanied by a corresponding increase in entropy in the surrounding environment. The daemon needs to store information about the molecules it observes, e.g., fast molecule approaching from left. To continue operating indefinitely, the daemon's memory must eventually be reset or erased to make room for new information. According to Landauer's principle, this erasure process must dissipate a minimum amount of heat into the environment, thus increasing entropy. The cost of erasing information. Charles Bennett further developed this idea, arguing convincingly that the crucial thermodynamic cost associated with the daemon is not the measurement itself, which can theoretically be done reversibly with minimal entropy cost, but the erasure of information from the daemon's memory. To complete a thermodynamic cycle and return the daemon to its initial state, ready to observe more molecules, the stored information about past molecular encounters must be discarded. This erasure inevitably increases entropy by at least the amount the sorting process decreased it, ensuring that the total entropy of the overall system, container plus daemon plus environment, does not decrease, thus upholding the second law. Essentially, the daemon pays for the decrease in entropy within the gas container by increasing entropy elsewhere, either through the process of measurement or, more fundamentally, through the process of forgetting or erasing the information it gathered. Information, it turns out, is not just an abstract concept but has real physical consequences tied directly to thermodynamics. Maxwell's daemon, therefore, ceases to be a paradox threatening the second law once the physical nature of information and the thermodynamic cost of information processing, especially erasure, are taken into account. However, it remains an incredibly valuable thought experiment. It played a crucial role in stimulating the development of information theory and forging the deep connection between thermodynamics and computation. It highlights that entropy isn't just about heat and disorder in the traditional physical sense, but is also intimately linked to information, knowledge, and uncertainty. It forces us to consider the fundamental physical limits of computation and observation. While the daemon cannot violate the second law, contemplating its operation opened up Schrödinger's cat. We now venture into the strange and famously counterintuitive world of quantum mechanics with perhaps the most iconic and often misunderstood thought experiment in all of physics, Schrödinger's cat. Proposed by the Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger in 1935, this experiment was not intended to describe a real procedure one could or should perform, but rather to highlight what Schrödinger saw as the absurd and paradoxical consequences of applying the principles of quantum superposition directly to macroscopic, everyday objects. Quantum mechanics describes the behavior of matter and energy at the atomic and subatomic levels. One of its core principles is superposition, which states that a quantum system, like an electron or an atom, can exist in a combination of multiple possible states simultaneously until it is measured or observed. For example, an electron might be in a superposition of spinning both up and down at the same time. Only when a measurement forces it to choose does it collapse into one definite state. Another relevant quantum phenomenon is radioactive decay, which is fundamentally probabilistic. We cannot predict exactly when a specific unstable atom will decay, only the probability of it decaying within a certain time frame. Schrödinger found the idea of superposition being confined only to the microscopic world unsatisfactory. If quantum mechanics is a fundamental description of reality, shouldn't its principles apply, at least in theory, to larger systems as well? To illustrate the bizarre implications, he devised his thought experiment. Imagine a sealed, opaque box. Inside the box there is a cat. Also inside the box is a vial of poisonous gas, a hammer poised to break the vial, a Geiger counter, and a tiny amount of radioactive material. The amount of radioactive material is chosen such that there is exactly a 50% chance that one atom will decay within 1 hour, and a 50% chance that no atom will decay within that hour. The setup is linked. If the Geiger counter detects radioactive decay, meaning an atom has decayed, it triggers the hammer to fall, breaking the vial of poison, which instantly kills the cat. If no atom decays within the hour, the hammer is not triggered, the vial remains intact, and the cat remains alive. The box is sealed and we wait for 1 hour. According to the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, the Copenhagen interpretation, prevalent at the time, The radioactive atom, until observed or measured, exists in a superposition of two states, decayed and not decayed. Since the entire system inside the box is linked to the state of this atom, the entire macroscopic system, including the cat, must also be described as being in a superposition of states. Therefore, according to a literal application of quantum superposition to this macroscopic setup, after 1 hour and before anyone opens the box to observe the outcome, the cat is neither definitively alive nor definitively dead. Instead, it exists in a bizarre quantum superposition of both states simultaneously. Cat equals alive state plus dead state. Only when an observer opens the box and looks inside does the quantum wave function describing the system collapse. At that moment, reality seemingly chooses one outcome. The observer finds either a definitively alive cat or a definitively dead cat. Schrödinger proposed this scenario not because he believed cats could actually be simultaneously alive and dead, but to highlight the absurdity he perceived in applying quantum superposition directly to the macroscopic world. He felt it revealed a fundamental problem or incompleteness in the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics. How does the transition occur from the quantum realm of superposition to the classical realm of definite states that we experience every day? Where is the dividing line, often called the Heisenberg cut? What constitutes a measurement, or observation, sufficient to collapse the wave function? Does it require a conscious observer, or just interaction with any large-scale classical system? Schrödinger's cat paradox crystallizes the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. The problem of explaining how and why the definite outcomes we observe emerge from the probabilistic superpositions described by the quantum formalism. Several interpretations of quantum mechanics offer different perspectives on the paradox. Copenhagen interpretation and related views. This traditional view posits that superposition applies only at the quantum level. Interaction with a macroscopic measuring device like the Geiger counter or arguably the cat itself is sufficient to cause wave function collapse long before a conscious observer opens the box. The cat is never truly in a macroscopic superposition. It's either alive or dead, determined by the microscopic quantum event, even before observation. However, defining precisely what constitutes a measurement remains a challenge. Many worlds interpretation, MWI as discussed earlier, e.g. with quantum suicide, MWI suggests that collapse never happens. Instead, every quantum measurement causes the universe to split into parallel branches, each corresponding to one possible outcome. When the radioactive atom state is determined, the universe splits. In one universe, the atom decays, the poison is released, and the cat is dead. In another parallel universe, the atom does not decay, the poison is not released, and the cat is alive. The observer opening the box simply finds themselves in one of these branches, experiencing a definite outcome, while their counterparts exist in the other branches with the opposite outcome. In MWI, the cat is never in a superposition of alive and dead within a single universe. Decoherence theory. This approach explains how quantum superpositions naturally and rapidly disappear for macroscopic objects due to interactions with their surrounding environment. Even tiny interactions, like air molecules bouncing off the cat or thermal photons, effectively measure the cat's state, entangling it with the environment in an incredibly complex way. This process of decoherence rapidly destroys the coherence needed for macroscopic superposition effects to be observable, making the cat effectively either alive or dead for all practical purposes extremely quickly, long before a human observer intervenes. Decoherence doesn't fully solve the measurement problem. It doesn't explain why we perceive one outcome, but it explains why we don't see macroscopic superpositions. Objective collapse theories. These theories modify quantum mechanics itself, proposing that wave function collapse is a real, spontaneous physical process that happens automatically when systems reach a certain size or complexity, independent of observation. In such theories, the cat, or even the Geiger counter, would be large enough to trigger collapse, ensuring it's always in a definite state. Schrödinger's cat remains one of the most potent illustrations of the bizarre and counterintuitive nature of quantum reality and the deep conceptual challenges involved in interpreting it. It forces us to confront the strange boundary between the microscopic world, governed by probability and superposition, and the macroscopic world of definite objects and outcomes that we experience. While intended as a critique, the thought experiment has become a cornerstone for discussing quantum interpretations and the enduring mystery of measurement, reminding us that the fundamental nature of reality might be far stranger than our classical intuition allows. The infinite hotel paradox. Let's check into a unique establishment that challenges our finite intuitions about numbers and collections. Hilbert's Grand Hotel, a thought experiment conceived by the German mathematician David Hilbert around 1924. This imaginary hotel is unlike any other because it has an infinite number of rooms, specifically a countably infinite number, meaning the rooms can be numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on, continuing forever without end. Hilbert's hotel serves to illustrate the counterintuitive and paradoxical properties of infinite sets. The first scenario begins with the hotel being completely full. Every single one of the infinitely many rooms is occupied by a guest. Now, a new guest arrives seeking accommodation. In a normal hotel with a finite number of rooms, a no vacancy sign would be displayed, and the guest would be turned away. But Hilbert's Grand Hotel operates differently. The clever hotel manager implements a simple procedure. The manager asks every current guest in room N to please move to room N+1. So, the guest in room 1 moves to room 2, the guest in room 2 moves to room 3, the guest in room 3 moves to room 4, and so on for all infinitely many guests. Since there is no last room, the rooms continue infinitely. Every existing guest has a new room to move into. This simultaneous shift frees up the first room, room 1, which is now vacant. The new guest can then check into room 1. Paradoxically, even though the hotel was completely full, it was still able to accommodate a new guest without anyone having to leave. This demonstrates a key property of countably infinite sets. They can accommodate the addition of a new element without increasing their overall size or cardinality, in the sense that they remain countably infinite. An infinite set can have a proper subset, in this case the set of rooms 2, 3, 4, that is the same size, has the same cardinality, as the original set, 1, 2, 3. This cannot happen with finite sets. If a finite hotel is full, it's full. Now let's escalate the situation. Suppose the hotel is full again, but this time, an infinite bus arrives carrying a countably infinite number of new guests. Guest A1, guest A2, guest A3. Can the manager accommodate them all? Again, surprisingly, yes. The manager implements a different strategy. They ask every current guest in room N to please move to room 2N. So, the guest in room 1 moves to room 2, the guest in room 2 moves to room 4, the guest in room 3 moves to room 6, and so on. This maneuver places all the original guests into the infinitely many even-numbered rooms, 2, 4, 6, 8. Suddenly, all the infinitely many odd-numbered rooms, 1, 3, 5, 7, become vacant. The manager can then assign the new guests from the infinite bus to these empty odd-numbered rooms. Guest A1 goes to room 1, guest A2 goes to room 3, guest A3 goes to room 5, and so forth. Once again, the completely full infinite hotel has successfully accommodated an infinite number of new guests. This illustrates another counterintuitive property. A countably infinite set combined with another countably infinite set still results in a countably infinite set. The size of infinity, at least countable infinity, doesn't change when you add another infinity to it in this way. Let's push it one final step further. The hotel is full. Now, an infinite number of buses arrive, each carrying an infinite number of new guests. Bus 1 has guest B1G1, B1G2. Bus 2 has guest B2G1, B2G2. Bus 3 has guest B3G1, B3G2, and so on infinitely. Can the seemingly beleaguered hotel manager possibly accommodate this infinite influx of infinite guests? Astonishingly, the answer is still yes, though it requires slightly more sophisticated room assignment, often invoking prime numbers or pairing functions. One common method uses prime factorization or a pairing function like the Cantor pairing function. A simpler, though perhaps less efficient, way to visualize it involves prime powers. Assign the original guest in room N to room 2, sup N/sup. Assign the kth guest from the jth bus, guest BJGK, to room 3, sup J/sup *5 sup K/sup. Since every number has a unique prime factorization, fundamental theorem of arithmetic, and we are using distinct prime bases, 2 for original guests, 3 for bus number, 5 for guest number on bus. Every person gets assigned a unique room number, and many room numbers, those with other prime factors or different structures, remain unoccupied. While this specific assignment leaves gaps, more advanced techniques can demonstrate a one-to-one correspondence, proving that even this doubly infinite influx can be accommodated within the single countably infinite set of rooms. Hilbert's hotel paradox is not a logical contradiction in the sense of the Liar or Russell's paradoxes. It doesn't reveal an inconsistency in mathematics. Rather, it's a pedagogical tool designed to show that infinite sets behave very differently from finite sets, and our intuitions, honed by experience with finite quantities, can be deeply misleading when applied to the infinite. The paradox highlights key results from George Cantor's revolutionary work on set theory and transfinite numbers. There are different sizes of infinity, e.g., the set of real numbers is a larger infinity than the set of integers, meaning they cannot be put into one-to-one correspondence. Hilbert's hotel deals only with the smallest level of infinity, countable infinity, also called Aleph null. Countably infinite sets have bizarre properties such as being equinumerous, having the same cardinality, with their own proper subsets. Operations that increase size for finite sets, like adding elements, do not necessarily increase the cardinality of infinite sets. Hilbert's hotel challenges us to accept that the mathematical concept of infinity operates under rules that defy everyday experience. It forces us to rely on rigorous definitions and logical deduction rather than visual or intuitive understanding. While we can never build a physical hotel with infinitely many rooms, the thought experiment provides valuable insight into the formal properties of infinite sets, which are crucial concepts throughout modern mathematics, from calculus to cosmology. It's a gateway to understanding the strange arithmetic of the infinite, where a full hotel always has room for more. The prisoner's dilemma. We now enter the fascinating field of game theory, which mathematically models strategic interactions between rational decision makers. The prisoner's dilemma, formalized by mathematicians Merrill Flood and Melvin Drescher in the 1950s and later given its narrative framing by Albert W. Tucker, is perhaps the most famous and widely studied game in this field. It presents a situation where individual rational self-interest leads to a collectively worse outcome than if the individuals had cooperated, highlighting a fundamental tension between individual gain and mutual benefit, and posing deep questions about trust, cooperation, and rationality. The classic scenario is presented as follows. Two members of a criminal gang, let's call them Alice and Bob, are arrested and imprisoned in separate cells, unable to communicate with each other. The prosecutors lack sufficient evidence to convict them on the principal serious charge, but they do have enough to convict both on a lesser charge, which carries a sentence of, say, 1 year in prison. The prosecutors offer each prisoner, individually and privately, the same deal. If you betray your partner, testify against them, or defect, and your partner remains silent, cooperates with the partner by staying quiet, you will go free and your partner will serve a long sentence, say 10 years. If your partner betrays you, defects, and you remain silent, cooperate, you will serve the long 10-year sentence and your partner will go free. If you both betray each other, both defect, you will each serve a moderate sentence, say 5 years. If you both remain silent, both cooperate, you will both be convicted only on the lesser charge and serve the short 1-year sentence. The dilemma arises when each prisoner rationally analyzes their options, assuming the other prisoner is also rational and self-interested, seeking to minimize their own prison time. Let's consider Alice's perspective. She reasons, suppose Bob remains silent, cooperates. If I also remain silent, I get 1 year. But if I betray him, defect, I go free. Going free is better than 1 year. So, if Bob cooperates, I should defect. Now, suppose Bob betrays me, defects. If I remain silent, cooperate, I get 10 years. But if I also betray him, defect, I only get 5 years. 5 years is better than 10 years. So, if Bob defects, I should also defect. Alice concludes that regardless of what Bob does, her best strategy is always to defect, betray. If Bob stays quiet, she gets 0 years instead of 1. If Bob betrays her, she gets 5 years instead of 10. Defection is her dominant strategy, the best choice no matter what the other player does. Bob, being in the exact same situation and assumed to be equally rational and self-interested, goes through the identical reasoning process and also concludes that his dominant strategy is to defect. Therefore, the predicted outcome, assuming both act rationally in their own self-interest, is that both Alice and Bob will defect, betray each other. As a result, they both end up serving 5 years in prison. Here lies the paradox. If they had both chosen to cooperate with each other, remain silent, they would have each served only 1 year, a much better outcome for both of them than the 5 years they get from mutual defection. However, the relentless logic of individual self-interest seems to drive them inexorably towards the mutually detrimental outcome of betraying each other. The pursuit of individual rationality leads to collective irrationality. The prisoner's dilemma captures a core problem in social interaction: the conflict between individual incentives and group welfare. It demonstrates why cooperation can be so difficult to achieve and maintain, even when it is mutually beneficial. The fear of being exploited, the sucker's payoff of getting 10 years while the other goes free, and the temptation to gain an advantage by defecting when the other cooperates often override the potential benefits of mutual trust. This basic structure applies to countless real-world situations beyond prison cells. Arms races: two countries might be better off if neither builds up expensive weaponry, cooperate, but each fears the other will arm itself, defect. Thus, both feel compelled to arm themselves, mutual defection, leading to a costly and dangerous stalemate that is worse for both than mutual disarmament would have been. Environmental issues: countries might agree that reducing pollution is beneficial for everyone, cooperate. However, each country might be tempted to continue polluting, defect, to gain an economic advantage, hoping others will bear the cost of cleanup. If all countries defect, the environment suffers greatly, a worse outcome for everyone than if they had all cooperated. Business competition: two companies might be better off setting a moderate price for their products, cooperate. But each is tempted to undercut the other's price, defect, to gain market share. If both defect, they end up in a price war that hurts both their profits, a worse outcome than stable, moderate pricing. Social situations: even simple things like contributing to a group project or keeping a shared kitchen clean can resemble a prisoner's dilemma. Everyone benefits if everyone contributes, cooperate, but individuals might be tempted to shirk their responsibilities, defect, hoping others will pick up the slack. If everyone defects, the project fails or the kitchen becomes unusable. How can cooperation emerge despite the logic of the dilemma? Game theorists have explored this extensively, particularly in the context of the iterated prisoner's dilemma, where the game is played repeatedly between the same players. In repeated interactions, strategies based on reciprocity, reputation, and potential future punishment or reward can make cooperation more rational. Robert Axelrod's famous computer tournaments in the 1980s explored various strategies for the iterated game. The surprising winner was a very simple strategy called tit for tat. Tit for tat starts by cooperating on the first move and then simply mirrors the opponent's previous move on subsequent rounds. If the opponent cooperated, tit for tat cooperates. If the opponent defected, tit for tat retaliates by defecting on the next round, but is ready to return to cooperation if the opponent does. This strategy is nice: it starts cooperatively; retaliatory, it punishes defection; forgiving, it returns to cooperation after retaliation; and clear, its rules are easy to understand. Axelrod found that such strategies, fostering reciprocity and punishing exploitation while allowing for forgiveness, tended to outperform purely selfish or consistently aggressive strategies in the long run. The prisoner's dilemma, therefore, is more than just a puzzle. It's a fundamental model for understanding the challenges of cooperation in a world of self-interested actors. It reveals the inherent instability of trust and the powerful incentives for defection, but also points towards the conditions under which cooperation can emerge, particularly through repeated interactions, reciprocity, and mechanisms that alter the payoff structure or build reputation. It forces us to think critically about rationality, self-interest, collective action, and the intricate dance between conflict and cooperation that shapes so much of human society and international relations. The original position. We revisit the work of John Rawls, focusing more closely on the hypothetical scenario he constructed as the foundation for deriving his principles of justice. The original position. While we touched upon it when discussing the veil of ignorance, the original position itself, as a carefully defined thought experiment, deserves deeper exploration. It represents Rawls's attempt to model a fair and impartial choice situation, purging the decision-making process of biases that stem from individual specific circumstances, talents, or conceptions of the good life. Recall that the original position is a purely hypothetical starting point, a state of nature analog in social contract theory, but one designed specifically for choosing principles of justice rather than forming a government. The key actors are rational individuals tasked with agreeing unanimously on the basic structure of their society. The defining feature, as we know, is the veil of ignorance, which drastically limits the information available to these parties. They know general facts about society, psychology, and economics, but nothing particular about themselves, their race, class, gender, talents, health, religious beliefs, life goals, or even the specific generation they belong to. Why construct such an artificial scenario? Rawls's goal was to find a method for justifying principles of justice that did not depend on pre-existing moral intuitions, which might differ widely, or on the bargaining power derived from individuals' actual positions in society, which would be unfair. He wanted to model a situation where the choice of principles would be truly fair to everyone, precisely because the choosers wouldn't know how those principles would affect them personally. The original position, constrained by the veil of ignorance, aims to embody this ideal of procedural fairness, leading to principles that anyone reasoning rationally under conditions of impartiality would accept. The rationality assumption is crucial. Rawls assumes the parties in the original position are rational in the standard sense of taking effective means to achieve their ends. Since they don't know their specific ends, their conception of the good life, Rawls argues they would focus on securing primary goods, things that are valuable means for pursuing any conception of the good life. These include basic rights and liberties, freedom of movement and choice of occupation, powers and prerogatives of office, income and wealth, and the social basis of self-respect. The parties want to choose principles that guarantee them the best possible share of these primary goods, especially focusing on ensuring a decent minimum level, given they could end up anywhere in the social hierarchy. The veil of ignorance ensures impartiality by removing the sources of bias. If you don't know whether you'll be rich or poor, talented or less talented, part of a majority or minority group, you have a strong incentive to choose principles that are fair to all these positions. You wouldn't choose principles that discriminate against a particular race because you might be that race. You wouldn't choose principles that allow for extreme poverty with no safety net because you might be poor. This leads Rawls to argue for the Maximin reasoning strategy mentioned earlier, maximizing the minimum. Faced with uncertainty about their future position, rational individuals behind the veil would prioritize making the worst possible outcome as good as possible. They would choose principles that guarantee the highest possible floor for the least advantaged members of society, rather than gambling on principles that might offer greater rewards for the well-off but risk catastrophic outcomes for those at the bottom. From this reasoning within the original position, Rawls derives his two principles of justice. Equal basic liberties for all. Social and economic inequalities are permissible only if they benefit the least advantaged, difference principle, and are attached to positions open to all under fair equality of opportunity. The original position thought experiment thus serves as the argumentative engine driving Rawls's theory of justice as fairness. It's not meant to describe a historical event or a psychological state, but rather a conceptual device, a standpoint we can adopt now to evaluate the justice of our own society's basic structure. We can ask ourselves, would the rules and institutions governing our society be chosen by rational individuals deliberating behind the veil of ignorance? If not, according to Rawls, those structures may lack a foundation in impartial justice. Critiques of the original position often focus on whether the setup is truly neutral or whether it smuggles in certain liberal or individualistic assumptions. Can individuals really reason independently of their social context and values? Is the focus on primary goods universally applicable? Is the Maximin strategy truly the most rational under uncertainty? Despite these debates, the original position remains a powerful and influential thought experiment. It provides a compelling framework for thinking about fairness by operationalizing impartiality. It forces us to consider the perspective of others, especially the most vulnerable, when evaluating social arrangements. By asking what principles we would agree to if we didn't know our own fortune or misfortune in life's lottery, Rawls's original position challenges us to design a society where the basic structure is acceptable and fair from all points of view, grounding justice not in power or tradition, but in reasoned agreement under conditions of equality and ignorance of self-interest. Swampman thought experiment. Our next thought experiment, proposed by philosopher Donald Davidson in 1987, pushes further on the themes of identity, continuity, and meaning, particularly challenging theories that rely solely on internal states or physical similarity to define personhood and mental content. The Swampman scenario asks us to consider the implications of creating a perfect physical replica of a person, questioning whether mere physical identity guarantees identical mental states, history, or even meaning. Imagine Davidson is walking in a swamp. Suddenly, tragically, he is struck by lightning and completely disintegrated, atom for atom. Simultaneously, purely by chance through some bizarre quantum fluctuation or another bolt of lightning hitting the swamp muck nearby, a new physical entity spontaneously assembles itself. This new entity is a perfect physical replica of Davidson, identical down to the last molecule, the last neural connection, the last microstate of his brain, just moments before the fatal lightning strike. This Swampman looks like Davidson, has a body identical to Davidson's, and presumably, if brain states determine mental states, has internal brain activity identical to Davidson's just before his demise. Swampman gets up, shakes off the swamp water, walks out of the swamp, returns to Davidson's office, recognizes Davidson's friends, seems to remember Davidson's past, writes articles that look just like Davidson's work, and interacts with the world in a way indistinguishable from how the original Davidson would have. The question is Swampman actually Davidson? Does Swampman have the same thoughts, beliefs, memories, and understanding as Davidson did? Can Swampman's words mean the same thing as Davidson's words meant? Davidson's answer, perhaps counterintuitively, is no. He argues that Swampman, despite being a perfect physical duplicate, lacks the genuine history of causal interactions with the world that is necessary for true thought, memory, meaning, and personal identity. Consider Swampman's apparent memories. When Swampman thinks, "I remember walking in the swamp," is this a genuine memory? Davidson argues no, because Swampman didn't walk in the swamp. The original Davidson did. Swampman has brain states that would correspond to a memory in Davidson, but since Swampman lacks the actual past experience, these states don't constitute real memory, merely a physical trace that mimics it. Consider Swampman's thoughts and beliefs. When Swampman thinks about Davidson's wife, is he truly thinking about her? Davidson suggests no. Swampman has never interacted with her. He has only an internal brain state identical to the one Davidson had, which was causally linked to Davidson's wife through past interactions. Swampman's internal state lacks the appropriate causal history to genuinely be about Davidson's wife. His thoughts lack genuine intentionality or reference. Consider Swampman's use of language. When Swampman uses the word chair, does it mean the same thing as when Davidson used it? Davidson, following principles of semantic externalism, similar to Putnam in the Twin Earth case, argues that the meanings of our words are partly determined by our history of using those words in interaction with our environment and community. Swampman lacks this history. His utterances of chair are physically identical to Davidson's, driven by identical brain states, but they lack the historical causal grounding that gives words their specific meaning within a language community. Swampman is merely mimicking linguistic behavior. Therefore, Davidson concludes Swampman is not Davidson. He is a distinct entity, a physical duplicate who lacks the history required for genuine mental states, memories, meaning, and personal identity as we understand them. Swampman doesn't know Davidson's friends. He merely reacts to them as Davidson would have. He doesn't understand the articles he writes. He merely produces symbol sequences identical to Davidson's. He is, in a sense, a complex automaton perfectly mimicking a person without possessing the underlying mental life, which requires historical connection to the world. The Swampman thought experiment is a strong challenge to purely internalist or physicalist theories of mind and meaning that suggest mental states are solely determined by the current physical state of the brain. If two physically identical brains can exist, but one, Davidson's original, has thoughts and meanings while the other, Swampman's, does not, then physical state alone cannot be sufficient for mentality. History, context, and causal connection to the world seem essential. The implications are significant for discussions of personal identity, artificial intelligence, and duplication. Personal identity. It suggests that continuity of memory in psychology isn't enough if it arises from mere replication rather than a continuous causal chain originating from past experiences. A perfect copy isn't the same person if the causal history is broken. Artificial intelligence. It raises questions about whether an AI, even one whose internal processing perfectly mimicked a human brain state, could have genuine understanding or consciousness if it lacked a history of interaction and learning within the world. Meaning and reference. It reinforces externalist views of meaning, suggesting that what our thoughts and words are about depends crucially on our causal links to the things in the world, not just on internal representations. Critics of the Swampman argument might question whether such a spontaneous replication is even coherent, or whether a being behaving indistinguishably from a person must be granted mental states, a more behaviorist or functionalist stance. Some might argue that Swampman would quickly acquire genuine thoughts and meanings as soon as he starts interacting with the world, even if his initial states lacked historical grounding. However, the core challenge remains. Swampman forces us to consider the importance of history and causal connection in defining who we are, what we think, and what our words mean. It suggests that being a person is not merely about having the right kind of internal structure at a given moment, but about being embedded in a continuous historical and causal web that connects us to the past and the world around us. It is a stark reminder that identity and meaning might be deeply rooted in our journey through time, not just our state at an instant. The Beetle in the Box. Our next thought experiment takes us into the intricate philosophy of language and mind, specifically addressing the possibility, or impossibility, of a purely private language. Proposed by Ludwig Wittgenstein in his posthumously published work Philosophical Investigations, 1953, the Beetle in the Box analogy challenges the notion that the meanings of words referring to our internal sensations, like pain, derive from private, introspectively accessible mental objects or experiences. Instead, Wittgenstein suggests, the meaning of such words must be grounded in public language use and shared criteria. Wittgenstein asks us to imagine a community where each person has a small box. Inside each box is something they call a beetle. However, a crucial rule applies: no one can ever look inside anyone else's box. Each person knows what a beetle is only by looking at their own beetle. They can talk about their beetle, describe it, compare it hypothetically to others, but they have no way of verifying if what's inside another person's box is the same as what's inside their own, or even if there's anything inside at all. It's entirely possible, Wittgenstein points out, that each person has something completely different in their box. One person might have a small insect, another a pebble, another a piece of wood, and another might have nothing at all. Yet they all use the word beetle in their conversations. They might say things like, "My beetle is active today," or "I think my beetle is similar to yours," or "I dropped my box and my beetle rattled." The question Wittgenstein poses is, what role does the actual object inside the box play in the meaning of the word beetle within this community's language game? His provocative conclusion is that the object itself plays no role whatsoever. The word beetle functions perfectly well in their language entirely independently of the private object it supposedly refers to. If the object varied wildly from person to person, or even if the boxes were all empty, the use of the word beetle in their public discourse could remain entirely unchanged. The private object drops out of consideration as irrelevant. Wittgenstein uses this analogy to critique the traditional philosophical picture of how words for sensations, like pain, acquire meaning. The traditional view, often associated with empiricists like Locke or introspectionist psychology, suggests that pain gets its meaning by referring to a private, internal sensation that only the individual experiencing it can directly access. Each person learns what pain means by associating the word with their own inner feeling. The beetle in the box analogy suggests this picture is flawed. If pain referred solely to a private, inaccessible inner object, like the beetle in the box, then we could never know if what I call pain feels the same as what you call pain. We could never be sure if others even have the private sensation, or if they just use the word pain appropriately based on external circumstances, like injury or crying. If the meaning were purely private, the word would become useless for communication. It would refer to something essentially unknowable to others. Instead, Wittgenstein argues the meaning of sensation words like pain arises from their use within a public language game, tied to publicly observable criteria and circumstances. We learn to use the word pain correctly by observing others who exhibit certain behaviors, wincing, crying, saying ouch, in certain situations, injury, illness, and by having our own expressions of pain corrected or confirmed by others. Does it hurt here? The meaning is established through shared practices, criteria, and connections to outward behavior and context, not by private ostensive definition, pointing inwardly to a private feeling. This doesn't mean Wittgenstein denied the existence of inner feelings or sensations. He wasn't a behaviorist claiming only outward behavior matters. His point was about how language functions and how words acquire meaning. The meaning of pain is not the private feeling itself, which is like the inaccessible beetle, but rather the word's role in our shared language connected to characteristic causes, expressions, and responses. The private feeling might accompany the use of the word, but it cannot be the foundation of its shared meaning. This argument against the possibility of a purely private language where words refer to inner experiences accessible only to the individual, with meanings established solely through private introspection, has profound implications. Understanding others' minds. It suggests that while we cannot directly access another person's subjective experience, we can understand their talk about sensations because the meaning is grounded in shared public criteria and use, not private objects. Nature of meaning. It shifts the focus of meaning from reference to private mental objects towards public use and social practice. Meaning is use. Critique of introspection. It casts doubt on the reliability of introspection as a primary source for understanding the meaning of psychological terms. The beetle in the box analogy challenges us to rethink the relationship between our inner world of experience and the outer world of shared language and behavior. It suggests that even our most private-seeming sensations acquire their linguistic meaning through their connection to the public sphere. While the subjective feeling of pain is undoubtedly real to the person experiencing it, the word pain functions and has meaning because it's woven into a shared web of observable circumstances, behaviors, and linguistic practices. The beetle may or may not be in the box, but the language game surrounding Beetle carries on regardless, its meaning found in the playing, not in the hidden contents. Gettier Problems. We now turn to a specific challenge within epistemology, the theory of knowledge, that fundamentally shook a long-standing philosophical definition. Gettier Problems, named after philosopher Edmund Gettier, who presented them in a short but devastatingly effective 1963 paper titled, "Is Justified True Belief Knowledge?" Are counterexamples designed to show that the traditional definition of knowledge, as justified true belief (JTB), is insufficient. They demonstrate scenarios where a person can have a belief that is both true and apparently justified, yet intuitively, we would hesitate to say they actually know it. For centuries, dating back at least to Plato, the standard analysis of knowledge held that for someone, let's call her S, to know a proposition P, three conditions must be met. Belief, S must believe that P is true. Truth, P must actually be true. Justification, S must have adequate justification or good reasons for believing P. This JTB definition seemed intuitive and robust. You can't know something you don't believe. You can't know something that isn't true, you can only mistakenly believe it. And you can't know something just by lucky guessing. You need some justification or evidence. Gettier's genius was to construct simple scenarios where all three conditions, justified true belief, are met, but where the justification is flawed in such a way that the belief is only true due to luck or coincidence, making us reluctant to call it genuine knowledge. Here is a typical Gettier-style example, adapted from Gettier's original cases. Imagine Smith and Jones have applied for the same job. Smith has strong evidence, provided by the company president, that Jones will get the job. For example, the president told Smith, "Jones is the person we've decided to hire." Smith also happens to know, perhaps by observing him counting them a few minutes ago, that Jones has exactly 10 coins in his pocket. Based on this evidence, Smith forms the belief. P. The person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Smith appears to be justified in believing P. His justification comes from two pieces of strong evidence. A. The president's testimony that Jones will get the job, and B. His own observation that Jones has 10 coins. Now, suppose that, unbeknownst to Smith, two things are true. First, the president was mistaken or misleading. It is actually Smith himself who will get the job, not Jones. Second, purely by coincidence, Smith also happens to have exactly 10 coins in his pocket. Let's evaluate Smith's belief P against the JTB conditions. Belief: Smith clearly believes P, the person who will get the job, has 10 coins in his pocket. Truth: P is actually true. The person who will get the job is Smith, and Smith does have 10 coins in his pocket. Justification: Smith appears to have good justification for believing P, based on the president's statement about Jones and his observation of Jones's coins. His reasoning process from that evidence to belief P seems valid. So, Smith has a justified true belief that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Yet, intuitively, we feel strongly that Smith does not actually know this. Why? Because his justification is based on false premises, that Jones will get the job. The belief turns out to be true only because of an unrelated coincidence, Smith also having 10 coins. The justification is not properly connected to the fact that makes the belief true. Smith's belief is true by luck, not by knowledge. Gettier problems typically involve a justified belief that is false, from which the person logically deduces another belief that happens coincidentally to be true. The justification flows through a false step, making the resulting true belief accidentally correct rather than known. The impact of Gettier's paper was immediate and profound. It demonstrated conclusively that the traditional JTB analysis of knowledge was inadequate because it failed to account for the role of luck or accident in making a justified belief true. Something more was needed to capture the essence of knowledge. Philosophers have spent decades trying to refine the definition of knowledge to overcome Gettier problems. Various approaches have been proposed, often referred to as JTB plus X theories, where X represents the missing condition. No false lemmas. One early suggestion was to add a condition that the justification for the belief must not rely on any false intermediate beliefs or lemmas. In the example, Smith's justification relied on the false belief that Jones will get the job. Since this lemma was false, Smith didn't have knowledge, even though his final belief P was true and derived from evidence. While this handles many Gettier cases, more complex counterexamples have been devised where the justification doesn't seem to explicitly rely on a single false lemma but is still defective. Causal theories. Philosophers like Alvin Goldman proposed that for a belief to count as knowledge, it must be caused in an appropriate way by the fact that makes it true. In the Gettier case, the fact making P true, Smith getting the job and Smith having 10 coins, did not cause Smith's belief. His belief was caused by evidence related to Jones. This approach emphasizes the importance of a reliable causal connection between the world and the belief. Reliabilism. This broader approach suggests that justification should be understood in terms of the reliability of the belief-forming process. Knowledge is true belief formed via a reliable cognitive process, like accurate perception, sound reasoning, reliable memory. In Gettier cases, while the reasoning step might seem valid, the overall process leading to the true belief often involves unreliable elements, like relying on misleading testimony or coincidences, thus disqualifying it as knowledge. Virtue epistemology. This view focuses on the intellectual virtues of the believer. Knowledge is seen as true belief attained through the exercise of intellectual virtue, like being careful, open-minded, thorough. Gettier beliefs, while true and perhaps resulting from some justification, are not seen as products of genuine intellectual virtue because luck plays too significant a role. Defeasibility theories. These suggest that for a justified true belief to be knowledge, the justification must be undefeated. This means there shouldn't be some other truth out there which, if the believer knew it, would undermine their original justification. In the example, the truth, Smith, not Jones, will get the job, is a defeater for Smith's original justification. Despite these efforts, there is still no universally agreed upon definition of knowledge that successfully handles all conceivable Gettier-style counterexamples and satisfies all philosophical intuitions. Gettier problems remain a central topic in epistemology, constantly forcing philosophers to refine their understanding of justification, truth, belief, evidence, reliability, and the subtle ways luck can intervene between our reasons for believing something and the way the world actually is. They serve as a crucial reminder that the connection between our minds and reality required for genuine knowledge is more complex and fragile than the simple formula justified true belief initially suggested. Thomson's Violinist. Our penultimate thought experiment plunges us back into the realm of applied ethics, specifically addressing one of the most contentious moral issues of our time: abortion. Proposed by philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson in her influential 1971 essay, A Defense of Abortion, the famous Violinist argument is designed to challenge a common anti-abortion argument, even if one grants the controversial premise that a fetus is a person with a full right to life from conception. Thomson uses this striking analogy to argue that having a right to life does not automatically entail having a right to use another person's body for life support without their consent. Thomson asks you to imagine the following scenario. You wake up one morning in a hospital bed. You find you are back-to-back with another person who is unconscious. You discover to your horror that during the night the Society of Music Lovers has kidnapped you. They found out that a famous unconscious violinist has a fatal kidney ailment. You, and only you, happen to have the exact blood type needed to help filter his blood. They have therefore plugged the violinist's circulatory system into yours, so that your kidneys are now filtering toxins for both of you. The hospital director informs you that detaching the violinist now would kill him. However, if you remain plugged in for 9 months, the violinist's own kidneys will recover, and he can then be safely unplugged. The crucial question Thomson poses is, are you morally obligated to remain plugged into the violinist for 9 months? Thomson's strong intuition, and the intuition she expects most readers to share, is that you are not morally obligated to remain plugged in. While it would certainly be kind and generous of you to do so, potentially saving the violinist's life, unplugging him even knowing it will lead to his death, does not seem morally impermissible. You were kidnapped and hooked up without your consent. The violinist, though innocent and possessing a right to life, does not seem to have a right to demand the use of your body, specifically your kidneys, for 9 months against your will, even if it's necessary for his survival. Your bodily autonomy, the right to control what happens to your own body, seems to take precedence in this situation. Allowing him to continue using your body feels like an act of supererogation, going above and beyond moral duty, not a strict obligation. Killing him directly might be wrong, but simply detaching yourself, refusing him the use of your body which he has no prior claim to, seems permissible, even if his death is a foreseen consequence. Thomson then draws the analogy to pregnancy, particularly cases resulting from non-consensual acts, like rape, though she extends the argument more broadly. She asks us to grant, for the sake of argument, that the fetus is a person with a right to life from conception, a premise she doesn't necessarily endorse but accepts hypothetically to challenge the anti-abortion argument on its own terms. Even granting this premise, she argues, does the fetus's right to life automatically entail a right to use the pregnant person's body for 9 months? The violinist analogy suggests not. Just as you are not obligated to sustain the violinist's life through the non-consensual use of your body, Thomson argues, a pregnant person, especially in cases where the pregnancy was not voluntarily undertaken, might not be morally obligated to sustain the fetus's life through the use of their body. Refusing to carry the pregnancy to term, i.e., having an abortion, might be seen as analogous to unplugging the violinist, withdrawing life support provided by one's own body, which the dependent entity has no independent right to demand. It is allowing the fetus to die by denying it the use of one's body, not necessarily an act of direct killing comparable to, say, shooting the violinist. Thomson's argument aims to shift the focus of the abortion debate away from the controversial question of the fetus's personhood and right to life, and onto the often overlooked issue of the pregnant person's right to bodily autonomy. Her central claim is that even if the fetus has a right to life, this right does not automatically trump the pregnant person's right to control their own body and decide whether or not to provide the extensive life support required by pregnancy. The famous violinist argument has been incredibly influential but also highly controversial, sparking numerous responses and critiques. Disanalogies. Critics argue there are crucial disanalogies between the violinist scenario and pregnancy. For instance, the violinist is a stranger, whereas a fetus is biologically related. The connection is imposed externally by kidnappers, whereas pregnancy arises internally, though the cause might be non-consensual. The 9-month duration is specific, while pregnancies vary. Some argue the relationship between a pregnant person and the fetus involves unique biological and potentially moral responsibilities not captured by the violinist analogy. Direct versus indirect killing. Some argue that abortion is more akin to direct killing than merely unplugging or withdrawing support, depending on the method used, thus making the analogy less apt. Implicit consent/responsibility. In cases of voluntary intercourse leading to pregnancy, some argue the pregnant person bears a degree of responsibility for the fetus's existence and dependency, creating obligations not present in the kidnapping scenario. Thomson addresses this partially with other analogies, but it remains a point of contention. Scope of bodily autonomy. While acknowledging bodily autonomy, some critics argue it is not absolute and can be overridden by the dependent entity's right to life, especially if that entity is considered an innocent person. Despite the criticisms, Thomson's violinist thought experiment fundamentally reshaped the philosophical discourse on abortion. It powerfully highlighted the importance of bodily autonomy in the debate and demonstrated that granting the fetus a right to life does not automatically settle the moral question of abortion. It forces even those who believe the fetus is a person to grapple with the difficult question of whether one person can be morally compelled to use their body for an extended period to sustain another, even if that other person will die without it. It remains a vital tool for exploring the complex interplay of rights, responsibilities, and the profound significance of bodily self-determination in ethical reasoning. The utility monster. Our next thought experiment serves as a potent critique of a major ethical theory, classical utilitarianism. proposed by philosopher Robert Nozick, whom we met earlier with the experience machine. In 1974, the utility monster scenario imagines a hypothetical being whose capacity for happiness or utility is vastly greater than anyone else's, raising serious problems for utilitarianism's core principle of maximizing overall happiness. Classical utilitarianism, associated with philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, holds that the morally right action is the one that produces the greatest amount of good, or utility, for the greatest number of people, where good is often defined as happiness or pleasure and the avoidance of pain. It's a consequentialist theory focused on maximizing overall well-being in the aggregate. When faced with a choice, a utilitarian should calculate the expected happiness/suffering produced by each option for everyone affected and choose the option that yields the highest total net utility. Nozick asks us to imagine a hypothetical being, the utility monster. This creature derives an immense amount of pleasure or utility from consuming resources. For every unit of resource it consumes, it experiences, say, 1,000 times more happiness than an ordinary human would from consuming that same unit. Now, consider how a utilitarian principle of maximizing total happiness would apply in a world containing such a monster alongside ordinary humans. If our goal is to maximize the overall sum of happiness in the world, the most efficient way to do this would be to funnel almost all available resources to the utility monster. Giving a resource, like food, wealth, or even personal attention, to the monster produces vastly more utility, 1,000 units in our example, than giving it to a human, 1 unit. Therefore, utilitarian logic seems to dictate that we should sacrifice the happiness and well-being of potentially everyone else for the sake of maximizing the monster's immense pleasure. We should feed the monster, cater to its every whim, even if it means widespread deprivation and suffering for ordinary humans, because the monster's astronomical utility gains would outweigh the collective human losses in the total aggregate calculation. This conclusion strikes most people as morally repugnant. It seems deeply unjust and counterintuitive to sacrifice the basic needs and happiness of many individuals simply to feed the gargantuan pleasure capacity of one being. Our moral intuitions often include notions of fairness, individual rights, justice, and perhaps a concern for equitable distribution, which seem violated by the utilitarian calculus in this extreme scenario. The utility monster thought experiment serves several critical purposes. Critique of aggregation. It highlights the potential problems with simply aggregating utility across individuals. Utilitarianism, in its classical form, doesn't necessarily care how happiness is distributed, only about the total amount. The monster scenario shows how maximizing the total can lead to extremely unequal and intuitively unjust distributions. Challenge to hedonism. If utility is defined purely as pleasure or happiness, the monster scenario suggests that maximizing this quantity might lead to morally grotesque outcomes, potentially making us question whether pleasure alone is the ultimate good we should be maximizing. Importance of individual rights/personhood. The scenario implicitly appeals to the idea that individuals have inherent worth or rights that shouldn't be sacrificed merely for the sake of increasing an overall total, even a total of happiness. It suggests that the separateness of persons matters morally. We can't just treat individual well-being as fungible units to be traded off for a greater aggregate sum. Utilitarians have offered various responses to the utility monster challenge. Diminishing marginal utility. One common response is to invoke the principle of diminishing marginal utility. This economic concept states that as a person consumes more of a resource, the additional satisfaction utility gained from each extra unit tends to decrease. A starving person gains immense utility from their first loaf of bread, less from the second, and perhaps very little from the 10th. If this applies even to the utility monster, then eventually, giving it more resources would produce less and less additional utility, making it no longer optimal to sacrifice everyone else. However, Nozick designed the monster specifically to not have diminishing marginal utility, or at least to have it diminish so slowly that the problem persists for all practical resource levels. The thought experiment challenges the principle even if such a being doesn't experience diminishing returns. Rule utilitarianism versus act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism evaluates each action based on its direct consequences for overall utility. Rule utilitarianism suggests we should follow general rules that, if consistently followed by everyone, tend to maximize overall utility in the long run. A rule utilitarian might argue that a rule like "don't sacrifice individuals for the aggregate good" or "respect basic rights" would produce more overall happiness in the long term, e.g., by fostering trust and social stability, than allowing case-by-case sacrifices to utility monsters, even if such sacrifices seem optimal in isolated instances. Questioning the coherence of the monster. Some might argue that the very concept of a being with such an unbounded capacity for utility from finite resources is incoherent or psychologically impossible, making the thought experiment unrealistic. However, its purpose is to test the logical implications of the utilitarian principle, even in hypothetical extremes. Refining the concept of utility. Perhaps utility shouldn't be defined simply as raw pleasure. More sophisticated versions of utilitarianism might incorporate concepts like well-being, flourishing, or preference satisfaction, which might be harder to concentrate infinitely in one being. However, it's often possible to reconstruct monster-like scenarios even with these richer conceptions of utility. The utility monster remains a powerful challenge to classical utilitarianism's aggregative approach. It forces proponents to either refine their theory, e.g., by incorporating distributional concerns, rights, or rules, or to bite the bullet and accept the counterintuitive conclusion that sacrificing the many for the astronomically happy few would, in principle, be the morally right thing to do under their framework. For non-utilitarians, the thought experiment strongly reinforces intuitions about individual rights, justice, and the inherent value of each person, suggesting that maximizing the overall good cannot be the sole principle guiding moral action. It vividly illustrates the potential conflict between maximizing aggregate welfare and respecting individual dignity. The Doomsday Argument. Our final thought experiment in this segment takes us into the unsettling territory of probabilistic reasoning applied to our very existence as a species. The Doomsday Argument, independently developed by several thinkers including Brandon Carter, John Leslie, and Richard Gott, is a controversial probabilistic argument suggesting that, based solely on our current position in the timeline of human history, we might be significantly closer to the extinction of the human species than we commonly assume. It's an argument that attempts to use Bayesian reasoning and observation selection effects to make a prediction about humanity's future longevity. The argument, in its simplest form, often associated with Gott's Copernican principle version, goes something like this. Assume you are a random observer of the human species, born at some point during its total lifespan, from its beginning to its eventual end. The Copernican principle suggests that you are unlikely to be born at a particularly special or privileged time in human history. Just as Copernicus showed Earth isn't the physical center of the universe, this principle suggests your birth moment probably isn't temporally special either. You are more likely to be born during a period when most humans live, rather than at the very beginning or very near the very end of humanity's total existence. Think of the total number of humans who will ever have lived, from the first Homo sapiens to the last, as n. Your birth rank, k, is your position in that sequence, e.g., you are the kth human born. If you are a random observer, your position k is likely to be somewhere in the middle range of the total n. It's statistically improbable, though not impossible, that you would happen to be born extremely early, e.g., among the first 1%, or extremely late, e.g., among the last 1%, in the entire sequence of n humans. Now, we can estimate our approximate birth rank, k. Current estimates place the total number of humans born throughout history somewhere around 100 billion. Let's use k is almost equal to 100 billion as a rough estimate of your position. The Doomsday Argument now uses this information to make a probabilistic prediction about the total number of humans who will ever live, n. If your position k, around 100 billion, is unlikely to be in the first, say, 5% or the last 5% of the total sequence n, then we can infer something about the likely range of n. Specifically, if we assume, using the Copernican principle loosely, that there's a 95% chance you are not among the first 5% of all humans who will ever live, it implies that your birth rank k is greater than 5% of n, k greater than 0.05 n. Rearranging this gives n less than k/0.05, or n less than 20 k. Plugging in our estimate for k, 100 billion, this suggests there's a 95% chance that the total number of humans who will ever live, n, will be less than 20 by 100 billion equals 2 trillion. Similarly, if we assume there's a 95% chance you are not among the last 5% of humans, it implies k less than 0.95 n, or n greater than k/0.95. This suggests n is likely greater than roughly 105 billion. Combining these suggests, with roughly 90% confidence between the 5th and 95th percentile, that the total number of humans n will likely be between roughly 105 billion and 2 trillion. The unsettling implication comes when we consider future population growth. If humanity survives for many thousands or millions of years more, colonizing other planets and growing its population significantly, the total number of humans n could easily reach vastly larger numbers, tens of trillions, quadrillions, or more. The Doomsday Argument, however, suggests that such large values for n are statistically unlikely based on our current estimated birth rank k. A relatively small upper bound for n, like 2 trillion, implies that humanity might not survive nearly as long or reproduce nearly as much as optimistic projections might suggest. It hints that extinction or a drastic population decline might occur sooner rather than later, perhaps within the next few centuries or millennia, preventing n from reaching truly astronomical figures. The argument essentially says, if humanity were destined to survive for millions of years and populate the galaxy, then the vast majority of humans would live in that far future. It would then be incredibly surprising for us to find ourselves alive now, so relatively early in that vast timeline. It's statistically more plausible that we are living in a time period that is not exceptionally early, meaning the total duration and total population n might be much shorter than we hope. The Doomsday Argument is highly controversial and faces numerous criticisms. Reference class problem. Which group are we a random sample of? Humans? Observers? Intelligent beings? The choice of reference class significantly affects the calculation. Assumption of random sampling. Is it valid to consider our own existence as a random sample from all possible observers across time? Perhaps our existence now is indicative of something special, e.g., we live in a period conducive to reflection on such arguments. Ignoring other evidence. The argument relies solely on our birth rank information, ignoring all other evidence we have about potential future risks, climate change, nuclear war, pandemics, asteroid impacts, and potential future progress, technological solutions, space colonization. A proper Bayesian analysis should incorporate all relevant evidence. Philosophical objections. Does the argument make sense? Can we really draw conclusions about the future based solely on our temporal position? Some find the logic flawed or the application of probability theory inappropriate in this context. Self-indicating assumption. SIA, an alternative assumption, suggests we should find ourselves in periods where observers are more numerous. If the future holds vastly more people, SIA might counteract the Doomsday Argument's conclusion by suggesting we should weight possibilities by the number of observers they contain. Despite the criticisms and its counterintuitive nature, the Doomsday Argument remains a provocative piece of reasoning. It forces us to confront the implications of observation selection effects. The idea that our own existence as observers influences the data we collect about the universe. It serves as a stark, if highly debated, reminder of the potential fragility of human existence and challenges overly optimistic assumptions about our long-term future based purely on extrapolation. It doesn't predict how doom might occur, only suggests probabilistically that the total number of humans might be smaller, and thus our remaining time shorter, than we might otherwise think based solely on our current position in history. Quantum suicide/immortality. We now return to the bizarre and mind-bending implications of quantum mechanics, exploring a thought experiment that pushes the many worlds interpretation, MWI, to its most extreme and existentially unsettling conclusion: the concepts of quantum suicide and quantum immortality. These ideas are purely theoretical and deeply disturbing, using the framework of splitting universes to speculate on the nature of subjective survival in the face of lethal probability. It must be stressed that this is a purely conceptual exploration and should never, under any circumstances, be attempted or considered as a real experiment. First, recall the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. MWI proposes that whenever a quantum measurement or event with multiple possible outcomes occurs, the universe itself splits or branches into multiple parallel universes, one for each possible outcome. All outcomes actually happen, just in different, non-interacting realities. There is no collapse of the wave function into a single state within one universe. Rather, all possibilities are realized across the multiverse. Now, consider the quantum suicide thought experiment, which is essentially a personalized version of Schrödinger's cat. Imagine a person sets up a device linked to a quantum event with two possible outcomes, each having a 50% probability per cycle, like the spin of a particle being measured as up or down. The device is rigged so that if outcome A, say, spin up, occurs, a weapon is triggered, instantly and painlessly killing the person. If outcome B, spin down, occurs, the weapon is not triggered, and the person hears a click, indicating they have survived that cycle. The device resets and repeats this process every few seconds. From the perspective of an outside observer watching a video feed, assuming they could, the situation seems straightforward probability. On the first cycle, there's a 50% chance the person dies and a 50% chance they survive. If they survive the first cycle, on the second cycle, there's again a 50% chance they die. The probability of surviving n cycles decreases exponentially, 1/2 raised to the power of n. After just 10 cycles, the chance of survival is less than 1 in 1,000. After 20 cycles, it's less than 1 in 1,000,000. From the outside, the person's death appears overwhelmingly likely, even inevitable, fairly quickly. However, the core of the thought experiment lies in considering the situation from the first-person subjective perspective of the person undergoing the experiment, assuming the many worlds interpretation is true. According to MWI, every time the quantum measurement occurs, the universe branches. In one branch, the weapon fires, outcome A, and the person dies. In the other branch, the weapon does not fire, outcome B, and the person survives and hears the click. Crucially, the person's stream of consciousness, their subjective experience, can only continue in the branches where they survive. Consciousness ceases in the branches where they die. Therefore, no matter how many times the experiment cycles, the only experiences the person can possibly have are those of survival. From their own first-person perspective, they will always find themselves in a branch where the weapon clicked harmlessly. They will hear click after click after click, surviving against seemingly impossible odds. This leads to the concept of quantum immortality. The argument suggests that, from a subjective viewpoint under MWI, an individual might never experience their own cessation of consciousness, provided there is any possible branch of the multiverse, however improbable, where they continue to exist. Their consciousness would always follow the path of survival, effectively making them subjectively immortal, even as countless versions of them perish in other branches. They would seem to themselves to lead a charmed life, surviving events that should statistically have killed them long ago. This thought experiment is deeply unsettling for several reasons. It seems unfalsifiable. The prediction of subjective survival is only accessible to the person in the experiment, who cannot communicate their experience back from the death branches or definitively prove they aren't just incredibly lucky in a single universe. Nature of identity. If countless versions of you are dying in other branches, what does your survival in one branch truly mean for personal identity? Is the surviving consciousness truly you, in the same way as before the branching began? Ethical and psychological horror. The idea is conceptually horrifying. While the subject experiences survival, the objective reality, across all branches, involves countless versions of them dying. It also offers no comfort regarding aging, illness, or suffering within the surviving branches. Reliance on MWI. The entire concept hinges on the many worlds interpretation being the correct description of quantum reality, which is far from established. Other interpretations, like Copenhagen, objective collapse, pilot wave, do not lead to the same conclusion. Quantum suicide/immortality is primarily used by physicists and philosophers as an extreme test case for the implications of the many worlds interpretation. Some argue it provides a potential, though ethically impossible, way to experimentally distinguish MWI from other interpretations. If MWI is true, the experimenter should subjectively experience survival against all odds. Others argue it highlights the absurdity or incompleteness of MWI, particularly regarding probability. If all outcomes happen, what does probability even mean? And the nature of consciousness. It remains a fringe, highly speculative and disturbing thought experiment, pushing the already strange implications of quantum mechanics into the realm of existential vertigo. It forces us to confront the possibility that the relationship between subjective experience, probability, and the fundamental nature of reality might be far more bizarre and interconnected than our everyday intuition can comprehend, especially if the universe is constantly branching into countless parallel streams of existence. The Turing Test. Our next thought experiment takes us back into the domain of artificial intelligence, but focuses not on inner understanding like the Chinese room, but on outward behavior and the challenge of defining intelligence itself. Proposed by the pioneering computer scientist and mathematician Alan Turing in his 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, the Turing Test offers a practical, operational benchmark for assessing whether a machine can exhibit intelligent behavior indistinguishable from that of a human. Turing sought to sidestep the thorny philosophical debates about whether machines can truly think or be conscious, questions he considered perhaps too ambiguous to answer definitively. Instead, he proposed replacing that question with a more concrete one, answerable through an experimental setup he called the imitation game. The standard interpretation of the Turing test involves 3 participants in separate rooms. A human interrogator, Judge C. A human respondent, Player A. A computer program, AI, respondent, Player B. The interrogator communicates with both Player A and Player B via text-based messages only, like a chat interface, without knowing which respondent is the human and which is the machine. The interrogator's goal is to determine, after a certain period of conversation, e.g., 5 minutes, which respondent is the human and which is the AI. The AI's goal is to convince the interrogator that it is the human. The human respondent's goal is simply to help the interrogator make the correct identification, by answering truthfully and naturally. Turing proposed that if an AI, under these conditions, could fool the interrogator into making the wrong identification a significant fraction of the time, he tentatively suggested fooling interrogators about 30% of the time after 5 minutes of questioning would indicate success by the year 2000, then the machine could be said to have demonstrated intelligent behavior equivalent, in this conversational context, to a human's. Passing the test would mean the machine's linguistic performance is indistinguishable from a human's. The elegance of the Turing test lies in its focus on observable behavior rather than internal states. It bypasses the need to define thinking or consciousness directly. If a machine can converse so fluently, creatively, and appropriately that a human judge cannot reliably tell it apart from another human, then for all practical purposes related to conversation, it is exhibiting human-level intelligence in that domain. However, the Turing test has faced numerous criticisms and interpretations since its inception. Behaviorism versus understanding. Critics like John Searle, with his Chinese room argument, argue that the test only measures the ability to simulate intelligent conversation, not genuine understanding or consciousness. A machine could potentially pass the test by using clever tricks, vast databases, and sophisticated pattern matching without having any real comprehension of the conversation's meaning. Passing the test proves behavioral equivalence, not necessarily mental equivalence. Focus on deception. The test inherently encourages the AI to deceive the interrogator. Some argue this is not a good measure of genuine intelligence, which might involve honesty, creativity beyond mimicry, or other qualities not directly tested by trying to fool someone. Limited scope, human chauvinism? The test measures only one aspect of intelligence, human-like conversation. It doesn't necessarily test other forms of intelligence, such as creativity, emotional intelligence, problem-solving in non-linguistic domains, or potentially non-human forms of intelligence that might be vastly different but equally valid. Is mimicking human conversation the ultimate benchmark for all possible intelligence? Practical difficulties. Conducting rigorous Turing tests is challenging. The results can depend heavily on the skill and sophistication of the interrogator, the duration of the test, and the specific topics discussed. Early successes by chatbots like Eliza showed that machines could sometimes fool naive users even with simple tricks, highlighting the need for careful experimental design. Moving goalposts. As AI has advanced, what constitutes passing the test has become a moving target. Simple chatbots no longer impress. Modern large language models, LLMs, can conduct remarkably human-like conversations, leading some to argue they have essentially passed the original spirit of the test, while others argue they still lack true understanding or consciousness, merely being sophisticated stochastic parrots. Despite these criticisms, the Turing test remains historically significant and conceptually influential. Operational definition. It provided one of the first concrete, measurable ways to think about and benchmark progress in artificial intelligence. Focus on performance. It shifted the focus from unanswerable philosophical questions about machine minds to the measurable performance of machine behavior. Driving force for AI. It served as a long-term goal and inspiration for AI researchers, driving the development of natural language processing and conversational AI. Public understanding. It provided an intuitive and accessible way for the public to grasp the aims and challenges of creating artificial intelligence. Today, while few AI researchers consider passing the Turing test as the ultimate proof of true AI or consciousness, it remains a valuable touchstone. The underlying question: how can we determine if a non-biological system possesses intelligence comparable to our own, is more relevant than ever. The test highlights the difficulty of defining intelligence solely through external behavior and forces us to consider what criteria, beyond mere conversation, might be necessary to attribute genuine thought, understanding, or consciousness to artificial entities. It stands as a foundational thought experiment in the quest to understand and create intelligence beyond the biological realm. Newcomb's paradox. Let's engage with a perplexing paradox that challenges the foundations of rational decision theory, pitting two seemingly compelling principles of choice against each other. This is Newcomb's paradox, formulated by physicist William Newcomb in the 1960s and popularized through philosophical analysis by Robert Nozick. It involves a hypothetical scenario with a highly reliable predictor, forcing a choice where different rationales lead to conflicting recommendations. Imagine you are presented with two boxes by a being, let's call them Omega, who has an extraordinary ability to predict human choices with near-perfect accuracy. Omega has successfully predicted the choices of countless people before you. Box A is transparent and clearly contains $1,000. Box B is opaque. It contains either $1 million or nothing at all. You have two possible actions. 1 boxing, take only the opaque box B. 2 boxing, take both box A with $1,000 and box B. Here's the crucial rule governing the contents of box B, based on Omega's prediction made yesterday about the choice you will make today. If Omega predicted yesterday that you would choose 1 boxing, take only box B, then Omega placed $1 million in box B yesterday. If Omega predicted yesterday that you would choose 2 boxing, take both boxes, then Omega placed nothing in box B yesterday. You know these rules, and you know Omega is an extremely reliable predictor, say 99% accurate or even effectively perfect. Omega has already made the prediction and placed, or not placed, the money in box B. Omega is now gone. You are faced with the 2 boxes. What should you do? Take only box B 1 boxing, or take both boxes 2 boxing? The paradox arises because 2 compelling lines of reasoning lead to opposite conclusions. Reasoning 1. Expected utility argument favors 1 boxing. This argument focuses on maximizing your expected financial gain based on Omega's predictive power. Consider the act of 1 boxing. If you do this, Omega almost certainly predicted it, given their high accuracy. If Omega predicted 1 boxing, then box B contains $1 million. So 1 boxing will very likely yield $1 million. Consider the act of 2 boxing. If you do this, Omega almost certainly predicted it. If Omega predicted 2 boxing, then box B contains nothing. So 2 boxing will very likely yield only the $1,000 from the transparent box A. Comparing the likely outcomes, $1 million is vastly greater than $1,000. Therefore, to maximize your expected utility based on Omega's known predictive accuracy, you should choose 1 boxing. This line of reasoning treats your choice today as evidence of Omega's past prediction. Reasoning 2. Dominance principle argument favors 2 boxing. This argument focuses on the situation at the moment of choice. Omega has already made the prediction and placed, or not placed, the money. The contents of box B are fixed. Your choice now cannot alter what's inside. There are 2 possible states of the world right now. State 1. The $1 million is in box B because Omega predicted 1 boxing. In this state, if you 1 box, you get $1 million. If you 2 box, you get $1 million plus $1,000 equals $1,001,000. In state 1, 2 boxing yields more money. State 2. The $1 million is not in box B because Omega predicted 2 boxing. In this state, if you 1 box, you get $0. If you 2 box, you get $0 plus $1,000 equals $1,000. In state 2, 2 boxing yields more money. In both possible states of the world, whatever is currently fixed inside box B, choosing to take both boxes, 2 boxing, yields exactly $1,000 more than choosing to take only box B. 2 boxing dominates 1 boxing. It gives a better outcome regardless of the fixed state of the world. Therefore, according to the dominance principle, a common principle in decision theory stating you should choose a dominant strategy if one exists, you should choose 2 boxing. This line of reasoning treats the contents of box B as fixed and your choice as independent of the past prediction at the moment of decision. Here is the paradox. 2 seemingly powerful principles of rational choice, maximizing expected utility based on known correlations/predictions, and choosing a dominant strategy based on the fixed state of the world at the time of choice, yield contradictory recommendations. Which principle should a rational agent follow? The debate often hinges on beliefs about causality and free will. Causal decision theory, CDT proponents of CDT typically favor two-boxing. They argue that rational decisions should be based on the causal consequences of the action itself. Your action now cannot causally affect omega's past prediction or the current contents of box B, which are already fixed. Therefore, you should perform the action that yields the best outcome given the fixed state, which is two-boxing, grabbing the extra $1,000. They often dismiss the expected utility calculation as confusing correlation between your choice type and omega's prediction type, with causation. People who one-box tend to be rich and people who two-box tend to be less rich, but that doesn't mean two-boxing causes the box to be empty. Rather, the type of person likely to two-box was predicted as such by omega. Evidential decision theory, EDT proponents of EDT typically favor one-boxing. They argue that rational decisions should be based on the action that provides the best evidence for a good outcome, or maximizes utility conditional on the available evidence. Your choice now provides strong evidence about what omega likely predicted yesterday. Choosing one-boxing is strong evidence that omega predicted one-boxing and put the million in the box. Choosing two-boxing is strong evidence that omega predicted two-boxing and left the box empty. Therefore, you should choose the action that serves as evidence for the best outcome, which is one-boxing. The paradox highlights a deep split within decision theory about how to handle situations involving predictable choices or correlations between choices and states of the world. Is it rational to choose an action because it's good news or good evidence regarding outcomes, EDT, or only because it causally produces good outcomes, CDT? Many find the dominance argument for two-boxing compelling. The money is already there or it isn't. Take the extra $1,000. Yet are troubled by the empirical observation that people who follow this logic consistently walk away with only $1,000, while those who one-box walk away with $1 million. Newcomb's paradox forces us to examine the core principles of rationality. What does it mean to make a rational choice? Should we aim to maximize expected outcomes based on all evidence? Or should we focus only on the causal impact of our actions in the present moment? The paradox reveals situations where these aims might diverge, leaving the definition of rational choice itself intriguingly unsettled. It remains a central puzzle in decision theory, philosophy of action, and discussions of free will and predictability. Sleeping Beauty Problem. Let's tackle a probability puzzle that delves into the complex relationship between belief, evidence, time, and self-location. How our knowledge of who or when we are affects probabilistic reasoning. This is the Sleeping Beauty Problem, formulated by Arnold Zuboff and later popularized by Adam Elga. It presents a scenario involving memory erasure and potential awakenings, leading to disagreement among philosophers and probabilists about the correct way to update beliefs. Here is the setup. On Sunday, Sleeping Beauty is told the rules of an experiment. She will be put to sleep. A fair coin will then be tossed. If the coin lands heads, Beauty will be awakened only once on Monday. After she wakes up and is asked a question, her memory of that awakening will be erased, and she will sleep until Wednesday when the experiment ends. If the coin lands tails, Beauty will be awakened twice. First, she will be awakened on Monday. After she wakes up and is asked the question, her memory of this awakening will be erased. She will be put back to sleep. Then she will be awakened again on Tuesday. After she wakes up and is asked the question, her memory of this Tuesday awakening will also be erased, and she will sleep until Wednesday. Crucially, because of the memory erasure after each awakening, whenever Beauty wakes up during the experiment, whether it's Monday/heads, Monday/tails, or Tuesday/tails, she cannot tell which day it is or what the coin toss result was. Her subjective experience upon awakening is identical in all possible awakening scenarios. The core question is, when Beauty awakens during the experiment, what should her credence, her degree of belief, be that the coin landed heads? There are two main competing answers, dividing philosophers into roughly two camps. The thirders, proponents of this view, argue that Beauty's credence in heads upon awakening should be 1/3. Their reasoning often goes like this. Before the experiment begins on Sunday, Beauty knows the coin is fair, so her credence P heads equals 1/2 and P tails equals 1/2. Now, consider the possible outcomes from the perspective of awakenings. There are 3 possible awakening scenarios she could find herself in. which seem equally likely from her perspective before considering her awakening itself. Heads and Monday, H. Mon. Tails and Monday, T. Mon. Tails and Tuesday, T. Tuesday. When beauty awakens, her experience is indistinguishable across these three possibilities. Since only one of these three involves heads, H. Mon, while two involve tails, T. Mon and T. Tuesday, she should assign a probability of 1/3 to being in the head scenario and 2/3 to being in one of the tail scenarios. Therefore, upon awakening, her credence P. heads awakened should be 1/3. This view emphasizes counting the possible observer moments or awakening instances. The halfers. Proponents of this view argue that beauty's credence in heads upon awakening should remain 1/2, the same as it was on Sunday before the experiment began. Their reasoning often emphasizes that the awakening itself provides no new relevant information about the coin toss outcome. Beauty knew on Sunday that she would be awakened at least once, on Monday regardless of the coin toss. The fact that she is currently awake doesn't tell her anything new about whether the coin landed heads or tails, as awakening was guaranteed. Since she gains no new evidence relevant to the coin toss simply by waking up, her credence should not change from its initial value of 1/2. This view often appeals to principles of conditionalization. Beliefs should only be updated based on new evidence, and the awakening itself isn't considered new evidence about the coin. Some halfer arguments also point out that if beauty were offered bets on heads/tails repeatedly upon each awakening, betting according to 1/2 probabilities would be a stable strategy, while betting according to 1/3 might lead to suboptimal long-term outcomes depending on how bets are structured across awakenings. The disagreement is subtle but profound, touching on fundamental issues in probability theory and epistemology. What constitutes evidence? Does the mere fact of being awake in this specific experimental context count as new evidence that should shift beauty's credence, even if the subjective experience is identical across possible awakenings? How to count possibilities? Should probabilities be assigned based on the possible states of the world, heads versus tails, or based on the possible subjective experiences or observer moments, H-Mon versus T-Mon versus T-Tuesday? Self-locating beliefs. How should we reason probabilistically when our evidence includes information about our own position within space or time, like, I am awake now? Does this self-locating information behave differently from ordinary empirical evidence? Further variations of the problem have been developed to test intuitions. For example, what if beauty is told upon awakening that it is Monday? Most agree her credence in heads should then become 2/3, using Bayesian updating, as knowing it's Monday eliminates the T-Tuesday possibility, leaving H-Mon and T-Mon, where heads is now twice as likely given the initial coin flip odds and the information Monday. This suggests the day information is relevant, adding complexity to the halfer claim that the awakening itself provides no relevant information. The sleeping beauty problem remains unresolved, with sophisticated arguments supporting both the thirder and halfer positions. It highlights the difficulties in applying standard probability theory to situations involving indexical information, information about I, here, now, memory manipulation, and multiple potential observer moments stemming from a single underlying chance event. It forces a careful examination of the principles of conditionalization, the nature of evidence, and how we should reason about our own place within the possible ways the world could be. It's a fascinating puzzle that reveals deep conceptual challenges at the intersection of probability, epistemology, and the philosophy of self. Parfit's psychological criterion. For our final thought experiment in this series exploring existential themes, we return once more to the intricate puzzle of personal identity, focusing specifically on the influential framework developed by Derek Parfit, particularly his emphasis on psychological continuity as what truly matters for survival. While we touched on this with the teletransportation paradox, Parfit's psychological criterion and his related concepts of relation are deserve closer examination as a distinct philosophical position on identity. As we've discussed, traditional views often tie personal identity either to the persistence of a physical body, body view, or an enduring, immaterial soul, soul view. Parfit, finding both of these problematic due to physical change, duplication scenarios, and the lack of empirical evidence for souls, instead focused on psychological factors, building upon the tradition of John Locke. Parfit proposed that personal identity over time consists in psychological continuity. This means that person B at a later time is the same person as person A at an earlier time if and only if there exists a sufficient chain of overlapping psychological connections between A and B. These connections include memories. B remembers experiences of A, intentions. B intends to carry out plans formed by A, beliefs, desires, character traits, and the continuous stream of consciousness. It's not required that B remember everything A experienced, only that there are enough overlapping chains of connection linking them together, much like the strands of a rope provide continuity even if no single strand runs the entire length. Crucially, Parfit added a condition based on the cause of this continuity. The continuity must be generated in the right kind of way, typically understood to exclude cases where psychological states are artificially induced or copied in a way that seems intuitively to break identity, though defining the right kind remains complex. He also initially included a non-branching clause. For B to be identical to A, B must be the unique continuer of A. However, through analyzing thought experiments like teletransportation and fission, where one person splits into two, both psychologically continuous with the original, Parfit came to a more radical conclusion. He argued that the non-branching clause required for strict numerical identity, one person cannot become two people, might be less important than the underlying psychological continuity itself. This led him to define relation R, psychological connectedness, direct links like memory, and/or continuity, overlapping chains, regardless of the cause or whether it involves branching. Parfit's profound and controversial claim is that relation R is what truly matters in survival, not necessarily strict personal identity. Consider the teletransporter that destroys the original and creates a perfect psychological replica on Mars. According to Parfit, relation R holds strongly between the person on Earth, A, and the person on Mars, B. B has all of A's memories, character, etc. Parfit argues that because relation R holds, this form of travel achieves everything that matters about ordinary survival, even if, strictly speaking, B is not numerically identical to A due to the physical discontinuity. Worrying about whether it's really you is, for Parfit, potentially missing the point. What matters is that your psychological life continues. Now consider the malfunctioning teleporter where both the original A and the replica B survive. Here, strict identity fails because one person cannot be identical to two distinct people. However, relation R holds between A before the scan and A after the scan, and between A before the scan and B, the replica. Parfit suggests that while identity breaks down, what matters, relation R, has occurred twice over. This might seem like double survival even though identity is lost. This reductionist view radically reconceptualizes what it means to be a person and what we should care about regarding our future. If personal identity is not a deep, further fact but simply consists in these chains of psychological continuity, then survival becomes a matter of degree. Relation R can hold to varying degrees, e.g., if only some memories persist. Survival isn't necessarily all or nothing. The self is less unified. We are perhaps more like a succession of overlapping psychological states than a single, enduring entity. Rational concern for the future. Our concern for our future self is justified because that future self will be psychologically continuous with us. Relation R will hold. But perhaps we should also have some level of concern for other future beings who might bear relation R to us, even if they aren't strictly us, like potential future copies. Ethical implications. This view might change how we think about responsibility, punishment, promises, and compensation over long periods or across significant psychological changes. If the person who committed a crime decades ago is only weakly psychologically connected to the person today, does that mitigate responsibility? Parfit's psychological criterion and his emphasis on relation R offer a sophisticated way to think about identity that accounts for change, embraces psychological factors, and attempts to resolve paradoxes raised by duplication and transformation scenarios. However, it remains controversial. Critics argue it devalues the sense of a unique individual self that feels central to our experience. Defining the right kind of cause for psychological continuity remains problematic. The implications for ethics and responsibility are complex and potentially disruptive. It may not fully capture our intuition about what matters. Many people do care deeply whether the future being is strictly them, or merely a replica sharing psychological traits. Parfit's framework, born from engaging deeply with thought experiments, represents a major contribution to the philosophy of personal identity. It challenges us to dissect our concept of selfhood and consider what elements truly constitute our persistence through time. Is it an unchanging soul, a continuous body, or the intricate, evolving web of our psychological life? By focusing on psychological continuity as the core of what matters, Parfit invites us to see survival not as the preservation of a static entity, but as the successful continuation of a dynamic psychological process, even if the traditional notion of a single, unique self becomes blurred in the process. It is a view that seeks understanding through reduction, finding what matters not in a mysterious core, but in the observable, though complex, connections that link our past, present, and future experiences.